The morning Harlan Voss stepped off the eastbound train in Colburn, Montana, he wasn't there to conduct business. He was there to finish what he'd started 3 years ago, destroying a woman who'd had the nerve to survive him. He smoothed his coat, adjusted the gold watch chain across his vest, and smiled at the station master like a man who owned every nail and every board on that platform. In his breast pocket sat a folded document he'd paid a Philadelphia judge $400 to sign without reading. It named Margaret Whitmore a thief. It named her a fraud. And it named Harlan Voss the aggrieved party seeking lawful restitution. He hadn't come for money. Margaret had none left. He'd made sure of that already. He'd come because word had reached Philadelphia that she was rebuilding, that some Montana rancher had sent for her, that she was, against every obstacle Harlan had placed in her path, about to have something resembling a life again. And Harlan Voss could not allow that. He asked the station master for directions to the sheriff's office, tipped his hat like a gentleman, and walked unhurried down the main street of Colburn with the quiet confidence of a man who had never once faced consequences for anything he'd done. If this story is already pulling at something in your chest, if you've ever watched someone be treated as though their age made them invisible, as though the years behind them outweighed every year still ahead, then stay with us. Hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling us your city and country. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Subscribe if you haven't yet, because the stories we tell here don't tie up neat and easy. They go somewhere real, and you won't want to miss what happens next. The advertisement had taken Wade Granger the better part of 3 evenings to write. Not because he was a slow writer, he wasn't particularly, but because he kept crossing things out. He'd write a line, read it back, and hear how hollow it sounded. Rancher seeks companionship. That made him sound like a man shopping for a piece of furniture. Widower looking for a fresh start. That wasn't right either, because he wasn't sure he believed in fresh starts anymore. He'd seen too many winters take things he'd thought were permanent. What he finally settled on was plain enough to embarrass him a little, which was how he knew it was honest. Montana rancher, 52, seeks a woman who has lived enough to know what matters. Not asking for youth or beauty, asking for someone willing to share the work and the quiet. I have a house that needs another person in it. I have enough to provide for 2. If you are a practical woman with a practical heart, and you are tired of being somewhere that doesn't want you, write to me. He'd included the ranch address and left off the name of the nearest town because Colburn was small enough that people would talk before the ink dried. They talked anyway. His foreman, a weathered man named Cletus Dowd, who had worked the Granger property for 11 years, had found the draft on the kitchen table and read it without asking permission. "You putting this in an actual paper?" Cletus asked. "Already sent it." Cletus set the paper back down. He was quiet for a moment, which with Cletus usually meant he was deciding whether to say the thing he was thinking or the thing that was safer. "People are going to have opinions," he finally said. "People always have opinions," Wade said. Doesn't cost them anything." Cletus nodded slowly. "Long as you know." Wade knew. He'd known before he ever picked up the pen. Colburn, Montana in 1883 was not a place that celebrated unconventional decisions, especially from a man who already had a reputation for keeping to himself after his wife Clara and their son had died in the winter of '77. 6 years of watching him manage that grief alone had given the town a certain narrative about Wade Granger, quiet, capable, and done with anything that required hope. Sending for a wife broke that narrative. The letters came back over the following weeks. A dozen of them, then more. Some were from women who wanted to leave difficult situations. Some were from women who sounded like they wanted rescuing rather than partnership, and Wade was honest enough with himself to know he didn't have that kind of energy to give. A few were clearly written by someone other than the woman signing them, which told him something he didn't want to know. And then there was Margaret Whitmore's letter. She'd written it herself, that was obvious. The handwriting was neat, but carried a slight hesitation in certain strokes, like someone who had learned to be careful about what they committed to paper. She told him she was 56 years old and thought he ought to know that before another word, because she had been surprised by enough people's reactions to her age that she'd decided to lead with it and let him decide immediately whether to continue reading. He'd continued reading. She'd told him she was a widow from Philadelphia. that she had run a boarding house with her husband for nearly 18 years, and that she knew how to manage a household, keep accounts, stretch provisions through a hard month, and handle difficult people without raising her voice. She said she was not a young woman, and she was not a beautiful woman, and she was not foolish enough to pretend otherwise. She said she was a capable woman who had stopped expecting life to be fair some years ago, but had not yet stopped expecting it to be something. She did not tell him what had happened to the boarding house. She said only that she was, at present, without resources and without good options, and that she was writing to him because his advertisement had sounded like it was written by someone who meant what he said. "I am not looking for rescue," she wrote. "I am looking for a place where my work counts for something again. If that is what you are genuinely offering, I believe I could be a good partner to you." Wade had read that letter twice, then put it in his shirt pocket and gone out to check the fence line along the east pasture, which didn't actually need checking. He walked the whole 3 miles of it anyway, thinking about those words. A place where my work counts for something again. He wrote back that evening. He told her what the ranch looked like, what the winters were like, what he expected and what he didn't. He told her there was a room that would be hers alone until they both chose otherwise, because he was a man who believed people needed their own ground to stand on before they could willingly share it. He told her the train came through Colburn on Tuesdays and Fridays, and that he would meet whichever one she was on. She wrote back once more. She said she would be on the Friday train, 3 weeks from the date of his letter. She said she would be wearing a gray dress and carrying a worn leather suitcase, and that she hoped he wouldn't be too disappointed. He'd written back, "I don't know what there would be to be disappointed about." He meant it. He wasn't sure she believed him, but he meant it. The 3 weeks passed the way weeks do when you're waiting for something. Too slowly until the last few days, then suddenly all at once. Wade told Cletus the day before because Cletus would need to know. Cletus had listened, said, "All right then," and gone back to repairing a saddle, which was either the most accepting response possible or a very practiced delay of his actual reaction. Wade drove the wagon into Colburn himself on Friday morning. The air had that particular October bite that came off the mountains in the early hours, cold enough to see your breath, but not cold enough yet to feel dangerous. The kind of morning that reminded you winter was patient, not absent. The train was on time, which it wasn't always. He stood near the edge of the platform with his hat in his hands, watching passengers step down. A family with too much luggage, a pair of young men who looked like they were looking for trouble or work and hadn't decided which, a woman in a green coat who was met immediately by a man who kissed her on the cheek. Then the platform was mostly empty, and the carriage door at the far end of the train was still closed. Wade walked toward it. Through the window he could see a woman still seated inside. She wasn't looking out. She was looking down at her hands, which were folded in her lap around the handle of a worn leather bag. Her hair was silver-streaked and neatly pinned. Her posture was the posture of someone trying very hard to appear composed. Even from where he stood, he could see her shoulders were shaking. He waited. A minute passed. The train let out a long breath of steam. The door finally opened, and she came down the steps slowly, one hand gripping the rail, the worn leather suitcase in her other hand, the modest bonnet, the gray dress, everything exactly as she'd described, except for the tears, which she had not mentioned and which she was making absolutely no attempt now to hide. She stepped onto the platform and stood still for a moment, as though she needed to be sure the ground was solid before she trusted her weight to it. Then she looked up and found him there. Around them, people noticed. They couldn't help it. A woman in late middle age, clearly crying, standing alone on a train platform in a small Montana town. It was the kind of thing people's eyes went to. Wade heard a woman's voice behind him say something low and cutting to the person beside her. He heard a man make a sound that was a laugh with the sound taken out of it. Margaret heard it too. He could see it land on her. Her chin dropped. Her eyes went to the platform boards. Wade walked toward her. He stopped close enough that he wasn't shouting, far enough that he wasn't crowding her. He was aware of every set of eyes on the platform. He didn't care about a single one of them. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. She looked up. Whatever composure she'd managed to pull together in the last few seconds fractured the moment their eyes met. Her lips pressed tight. She nodded once, quickly, because speaking wasn't something she could manage right then. He said, "You don't have to pretend you're strong anymore." What happened next was not what he expected. And later he would understand that nothing he could have expected would have been adequate anyway. The tears that had been streaming down her face became something else entirely. A sound came out of her that was not quite a sob and not quite a cry, but something older and more exhausted than either. The sound of a person who had been holding something at bay for so long that the moment it was no longer necessary, the release of it was almost violent. She didn't reach for him. She didn't fall against him. She stood exactly where she was, on that public platform with the whole town watching, and she wept without apology, without trying to soften it or explain it or rush through it. And Wade Granger stood in front of her and let her, because he was a man who had lost enough to understand that some grief cannot be managed. It can only be witnessed. Behind them, someone laughed outright. A woman's voice, not even bothering to keep it quiet. "Lord, look at that. He ordered himself a grandmother." Another voice answered, "Poor fool didn't know what he was getting." Wade did not turn around. He picked up Margaret's suitcase from where it had slipped from her hand and stood quietly until the worst of it had passed, which took longer than was comfortable by anyone's measure and exactly as long as it needed to. When she finally drew a shaky breath and pressed the back of her hand to her face, she looked at him with an expression that was braced for damage, for the small cruelty of pity or the larger cruelty of regret, or the particular devastation of being looked at like a mistake. "I'm sorry," she managed. "I had not planned to—" "Don't apologize," he said. "I've made a scene." "It's not your scene to apologize for." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her expression shifted, not into relief exactly, more like a cautious recalibration, the look of someone who has calculated for a certain kind of terrain and found themselves in different geography entirely. "I should tell you," she said, her voice still unsteady, "that I may not be exactly what you were hoping for." "I wasn't hoping for anything specific," he said. "I was hoping for you. Let's go." He carried the suitcase toward the wagon. She followed, and the people of Colburn watched them go and had their opinions, which cost them nothing, exactly as Wade had known they would. The ride from town to the ranch was a good 40 minutes over roads that hadn't been well graded since before the summer floods, and the wagon was not a comfortable vehicle under the best of conditions. Wade drove, and Margaret sat beside him with her hands in her lap, and neither of them spoke for the first while. And the silence between them was the particular kind that happens when two people are deciding how much truth to tell. Wade let her have the quiet. He'd found in his experience that forcing conversation out of people before they were ready just produced words that didn't mean much, and he'd rather have a long silence than a short lie. Margaret broke it after perhaps 10 minutes. "I should tell you something," she said without preamble. "All right. The crying at the station, it wasn't—" She paused. "It wasn't because I was frightened of you or uncertain about coming. I want you to know that." "I didn't think it was." "Then you may be the only person on that platform who didn't." She was looking at the road ahead, not at him. "People see a woman my age weeping in public, and they draw certain conclusions. That she's lost her faculties, or she's being victimized, or she's simply diminished in some way." "What was it then?" He kept his eyes on the horses. "If you want to say." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "Relief, mostly." Which is embarrassing to admit because I'd convinced myself I was past expecting anyone to say a kind thing. He didn't respond immediately because he was thinking about that. The weight of what it cost a person to be past expecting kindness. Not to have decided against expecting it, which was a kind of strategy, but to be genuinely past it, done with the possibility. "The town's going to talk," he said, which was not a response to what she'd said, but was a true thing that needed to be out between them. "They already were," she said. "I heard them." "Does that bother you?" She considered. "It used to. In Philadelphia, there was a time when what people said about me was the thing I was most afraid of." She adjusted her hands in her lap. "I've had a few years to revise my list of fears. Public opinion has dropped considerably." He glanced at her sideways. It was the closest he'd come to a smile in weeks. "Good." The ranch came into view around a long curve in the road, appearing the way it always did from this approach, unexpectedly, as though the land had been withholding it until you'd earned the sight of it. 340 acres of mixed grassland and rocky high ground, with the Bitterroot Mountains pressed against the western horizon like a permanent argument. The main house was not large, but it was solid, built by Wade's father and reinforced twice since, with a covered porch that ran the full width of the south face and windows that caught the afternoon light and held it. Margaret didn't say anything when she saw it. She just looked. "It's more than I expected," she said finally. "It's more than it looks from a distance," he said. "Or less, depending on what you look at. The barn roof wants replacing. I know it." "The fence line along the near pasture is sagging," she observed. He looked at her. She was still looking at the property, and her expression was the expression of someone who was seeing something practical rather than something picturesque, which told him something about her that the letters hadn't quite managed to. "It is," he said, "has been since July. I can see from here that the garden space south of the house has gone to seed. Was that intentional?" "No, I just haven't had enough hours." She nodded, and there was something in the nod that wasn't judgment, but inventory. The look of a person making a quiet list. Cletus was in the yard when they pulled in, pretending to do something with a length of rope that didn't actually need doing. He was not a subtle man. Wade made the introduction, and Cletus shook Margaret's hand with the careful grip of someone who has been instructed by life not to underestimate people based on appearance, but was still in the process of that lesson. "Ma'am," he said. "Mr. Dowd," she said, "is the smaller storage room off the kitchen the one with the broken latch, or is that a different door?" Cletus blinked. Yes, ma'am. The latch has been on my list." "I can fix that," she said, "if you could show me where you keep the tools." Cletus looked at Wade. Wade looked back at him with an expression that said absolutely nothing. Cletus looked back at Margaret with the expression of a man whose list of assumptions had just been quietly reorganized. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I can do that." Inside, Wade showed her through the house, the kitchen, the sitting room, the room that would be hers, at the end of the hall with the south-facing window. He told her what he'd told her in the letter. It was hers until they both chose otherwise. He put her suitcase just inside the door and did not go further into the room, which she noticed. She set her bonnet on the dresser and looked around at the sparse furniture. A bed, a wardrobe, a small table with a pitcher and basin. Clean. Not much more than clean. "I can get you what you need for it," he said from the doorway. "Just tell me." She turned around. Her eyes were dry now, and what he saw in her face was concentration, the focused look of a mind that was already running calculations about something. "I'll tell you what I need after I've seen what's already here," she said. "I don't like asking for things before I know what's missing." That afternoon, while Wade was out checking the east fence line, it genuinely needed checking this time, Margaret Whitmore walked the house and the yard and the kitchen garden with the systematic attention of someone who has managed a household before and is assessing a different one's strengths and deficiencies. She wasn't critical. She wasn't performing. She was simply looking at what was there and what wasn't and organizing the information. By the time Wade came in for supper, she had repaired the latch on the storage room, reorganized the dry goods shelves in the pantry so that things were visible and accessible, instead of stacked in the order they'd happened to be placed, and had started a pot of something on the stove that smelled considerably better than anything that had come out of that kitchen since Cletus had briefly attempted to do the cooking 2 winters back. Cletus came in after Wade and stopped in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the reorganized pantry. He looked at the pot on the stove. He looked at Margaret, who was sitting at the kitchen table going through a ledger book she'd found on the shelf, making small penciled notations in the margin. "That's Mr. Granger's account book," he said, not accusatory, just noting. "I know," she said. "He's been overcharged on grain for at least the last 8 months. I'm trying to determine if it started before that." She turned a page. "Do you know who handles the purchasing when Mr. Granger is on the range?" Cletus opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Wade. "She's asking you," Wade said. "That'd be me," Cletus said. "And I'll be honest, ma'am, I don't think I've been cheated. I know Jonas Perrin at the feed store, and he may not be doing it deliberately," she said pleasantly. "Sometimes errors accumulate without intent. But the weight measurements on these receipts don't correspond to the prices listed, and the discrepancy runs the same direction every time, which is the kind of pattern that doesn't usually happen by accident." She closed the ledger and looked up at him with an expression that was entirely without hostility. I'm not saying Mr. Perrin is dishonest. I'm saying someone should look at his scale. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a person says something that rearranges a room. Cletus sat down slowly in the chair across from her. How much? He said. Over 8 months? Roughly $40. She paused. Possibly more if it predates these records. $40 was not a small amount. Cletus looked at Wade. Wade was looking at Margaret with an expression he hadn't planned on wearing. I'll go see Jonas Perrin tomorrow, Cletus said. Take the ledger, she said, and the receipts from the back sleeve. I've marked the relevant entries. Supper that night was a quiet meal, which was usual. What was not usual was that there were 3 people at the table instead of 2, and the food was good enough that the silence felt comfortable rather than empty, which was a different kind of quiet entirely. Wade noticed that Margaret ate without much appetite, and guessed she was tired enough that eating felt like an obligation. He didn't comment on it. After supper, when Cletus had gone to the bunkhouse and the dishes were done, she'd insisted on doing them herself, which he'd let stand because it was clear she needed the occupation of her hands. Wade sat at the kitchen table with his coffee, and she sat across from him, and they had the conversation they'd been moving toward all day. There's something I didn't tell you in the letters, she said. He waited. About what happened in Philadelphia, why I had nothing left. She looked at her coffee cup rather than at him. I told you my husband died. I told you I'd run the boarding house. I didn't tell you what happened after. You don't have to tell me tonight. I'd rather tell you now, she said, before I lose the courage for it. She pressed her fingers against the cup. My husband Robert's family had never approved of me. I was not from money. His family had some standing, and they had always felt he'd married beneath himself. When he died, they moved very quickly. She paused. There were documents, legal papers claiming Robert had intended the property to be transferred to his brother's management. I know Robert signed nothing of the kind. He didn't trust his brother. He'd told me so more than once. Her voice had gone careful and controlled, the voice of someone telling a story they've told themselves many times, testing each word before committing to it. But the papers had what looked like his signature, and I had no lawyer, and the men his family knew were the same men who sat on the town boards and the court, and within 4 months I had nothing. The house, the boarding house, the furniture, the savings, all of it transferred, legally, on paper, to Robert's brother and his wife. Wade didn't say anything. He let her have the telling. What was worse than losing the property, she said, was what they said to explain it. They told everyone that grief had made me unstable, that I'd been spending erratically, mismanaging the accounts, behaving in ways that were erratic. None of it was true, but it was what they said, and people believe the family of a dead man before they believe his widow, especially when the widow is... She stopped. When the widow is your age, he said. She looked up. Yes, when a woman is past a certain age, people are very willing to believe she's lost her grip on things. It's convenient. It explains everything without requiring anyone to look too closely at what actually happened. Outside, the October wind came off the mountains and pressed against the house walls, testing the window frames. The lamp on the table made a small circle of warmth that didn't reach the corners of the room. How long ago? He asked. 3 years? And since then? She was quiet for a moment. I have been in a series of situations that were better than nothing, which is not a description I would wish on anyone. She looked at him directly. I worked as a seamstress for a time, until my eyes began to trouble me with the close work. I kept house for a family in Baltimore for several months, until the wife decided she preferred a younger woman for the position. I tried 3 times to find work that matched what I actually know how to do, which is manage a property and keep accounts, and I was told 3 times, in 3 different ways, that a woman my age would not be appropriate. So you answered my advertisement. I answered your advertisement, she said, because it was the first thing in 3 years that treated my age as a fact about me rather than a verdict. Wade turned his coffee cup in his hands. He was thinking about what she'd just told him, not with the quick surface thinking that led to immediate responses, but with the slower kind that wanted to understand the shape of something before deciding what to say about it. The relatives, he said. The brother. Are they the ones who... Are they who you were running from when you came here? She shook her head. I wasn't running from them. They took what they wanted. They're done with me. A pause. I was running from being nowhere. From being a woman that everyone had collectively decided was finished. She looked at the table. It's a very specific kind of loneliness. Being invisible not because people don't see you, but because they look at you and decide there's nothing there worth seeing. He said, I see you. It was not a rhetorical thing. He meant it the way you mean something you've understood before you've found the words for it. Margaret looked up at him, and her expression was not soft exactly. She was not a woman who did soft things easily, he was beginning to understand, but it was unguarded in a way he suspected she rarely allowed herself. I know, she said. That's why I'm still sitting at this table instead of wondering how to get back to the train station. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. Somewhere outside, one of the horses shifted in the barn, the familiar sound of an animal adjusting its weight in the dark. Wade said, You'll be all right here, Margaret. It was not a promise of ease, and she understood that. The ranch was hard. The winters were harder. The town had already shown her what it thought, and it would not change that opinion without being given substantial reason to. But he meant it as a fact, not reassurance, but an assessment. Based on 40 minutes of watching her work, 4 months of letters, and one long conversation at a kitchen table in October. This was a woman who had held herself together through things that had broken other people, and she had arrived here still capable of fixing latches and catching accounting errors and telling the truth when it was easier to keep quiet. She would be all right here. She nodded once, slowly. I intend to be. She stood then and took their cups to the basin and washed them without being asked. And Wade Granger sat at his kitchen table and listened to the familiar sounds of another person moving through his house. And for the first time in 6 years, those sounds did not feel like an absence. They felt like the beginning of something he hadn't known how to name until now, and maybe couldn't name yet even still. But it was there. Whatever it was. It was there. She was up before him the next morning. Wade came into the kitchen at 5:30, which was earlier than most people considered reasonable, and exactly when he'd been rising for the past 15 years, and Margaret was already at the stove. Not in a performative way, not in the way of someone trying to demonstrate usefulness on their first full day, but in the way of a person who had woken early because sleeping longer wasn't available to her. There were circles under her eyes that hadn't been visible the night before, or maybe they had been, and he hadn't looked closely enough. She turned when she heard him come in. Coffee's ready. You didn't have to... I was awake, she said, which closed that conversation. He poured himself a cup and stood near the window and drank it, while the early dark outside began its slow argument with the dawn. She was making something with the cornmeal and the dried salt pork from the pantry shelf, moving with the economy of motion that belonged to people who had cooked in small spaces for a long time. You sleep all right? He asked. A pause. Well enough. He understood from the pause that the answer was no. He didn't push it. After a few minutes, she said without turning from the stove, I looked at the rest of the account books last night, the ones from the 2 years before the records I saw yesterday. He set his cup down. I only have those going back about 4 years total. I know, I found them on the shelf in the sitting room. She stirred something in the pan. The grain overcharging goes back at least 30 months. The total discrepancy across that period is closer to $210. The number landed in the quiet kitchen like a stone dropped in still water. $210 in this territory, in this economy, was not an abstraction. It was a new barn roof and a replacement plow and 3 months of wages for a hired hand. You're certain, he said. I cross-referenced the receipts with the current pricing at 2 other suppliers I found mentioned in older correspondence. I'm certain. She put the pan aside and turned to face him, leaning one hand on the edge of the counter. I'm not saying you were careless, Wade. I want to be clear about that. The discrepancy is designed to be small enough each time that no single transaction looks wrong. It's only when you lay them all side by side that the pattern becomes visible. She paused. Someone put thought into it. He was quiet, processing this. Outside, he could hear Cletus already moving in the yard, the particular sounds of morning chores beginning. I'll go into town with Cletus today, Wade said. Do you want me to write out a summary of the figures? Something you can hand to the sheriff. He looked at her. You do that now? This morning? It won't take me long, she said. I have the numbers in my head. I just need the paper. He thought about that. About a woman who'd been in his house less than 24 hours and had already found a $200 theft and was offering to document it at 6 in the morning before breakfast was finished. He thought about the ledger and the receipts with her small penciled marks and the way she'd asked Cletus about the purchasing without making him feel accused. After breakfast, he said. She turned back to the stove. After breakfast. They ate with Cletus, who had come in stamping mud from his boots, and Margaret served the three of them without ceremony and ate her own portion quietly. Cletus was watching her with the sidelong attention of a man revising his opinion of something in real time, though he was doing his best not to be obvious about it, which he mostly wasn't. That grain business, he said after a while. We're going to look into it today, Wade said. Cletus nodded. He looked at his plate. Then he said to Margaret specifically, I should have caught it. The amounts were small, she said, and you had other things to watch. Still. Mr. Dowd, she said, and her tone was not unkind, but it was clear. I spent 18 years managing accounts, and I am telling you the discrepancy was designed to be missed. If you spend time reproaching yourself for not seeing it, you are spending time that would be more usefully directed elsewhere. That's not comfort. That's just arithmetic. Cletus stared at her for a moment. Then he made a sound that was almost a laugh. Yes, ma'am. After breakfast, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with 2 sheets of paper and wrote out a clean accounting of every discrepancy Wade had asked her to do it, without looking at the ledger again, pulling the figures from memory with a precision that he watched from across the table. With something between admiration and a kind of quiet amazement, she had organized the entire record in her head overnight. She handed him the sheets folded in thirds. The sheriff may not act on it immediately, she said. Men in official positions prefer to move at their own pace when it involves other men they know socially. Don't push too hard the first visit, let the numbers speak. You've dealt with sheriffs before, he said. Her expression shifted slightly. Not quite to something dark, but in that direction. I've dealt with officials before, yes. He took the papers and didn't ask her to say more than that. He and Cletus drove into Colburn, and Margaret stayed at the ranch because it made no sense for her to go, and also because the town had already seen her cry on a train platform, and she had no interest in giving it a second show before she'd found her footing. She used the time while they were gone to do things that needed doing. She repaired a section of the porch step that had soft wood, working with a handsaw, and the replacement boards she found in the lean-to at the side of the barn. It took her longer than it would have taken someone younger or stronger, and she stopped twice when her shoulder complained, and the finished result was functional rather than beautiful. But it held weight, which was the point. She also spoke with the 2 ranch hands, young men named Doyle and Perkins, neither of them more than 25, who had watched her work on the porch step from a cautious distance until she'd asked them directly to hand her the nails that were just out of her reach. After that, they'd hovered in the way of young men who want to help but haven't been given clear instructions. What needs doing most on this property right now? She asked them while she hammered. The 2 of them exchanged a look. Doyle said, the fence on the east pasture's been needing work since July. How much fence? Maybe a 1/4 mile of bad posts. And the barn roof? That's worse, Perkins said. We've been patching it, but there's a section on the north side that's going to go through when the snow comes. What's stopping the repair? Another exchange of looks. Doyle said, Mr. Granger's been short on time, ma'am. He does the work of 2 men most days, and the ranch hands aren't... He stopped, reconsidering how to say what he wanted to say. There aren't enough of us, Perkins said, more directly. There should be 1 more man on a property this size, but the budget... He stopped too. But the budget has been tighter than it should be, Margaret finished. Yes, ma'am. $210, she thought. There was the extra hand and the barn roof and the fence posts and something left over besides. Wade and Cletus came back in the early afternoon, and from the set of Wade's shoulders as he climbed down from the wagon, Margaret could tell the visit had been complicated. She waited until they were inside. The sheriff knows Perrin, Wade said. He sat down at the kitchen table and pressed 2 fingers to the space between his eyebrows. They go back to before the town had a sheriff's office. They play cards together on Thursday evenings, apparently. Did he refuse to look at the documents? No, he looked at them. A pause. He said he'd look into it, which Cletus tells me is the phrase he uses when he intends to do as little as possible without technically refusing. Cletus confirmed this with a look. Is there anyone else? Margaret asked. A county official? A judge? There's a circuit judge who comes through every 6 weeks. He's due in about 3 weeks. She nodded. Then we wait 3 weeks. You're not frustrated? Wade looked at her. Oh, I'm frustrated, she said, but I've learned the difference between being frustrated and doing something stupid because I'm frustrated. She pulled the ledger toward her on the table. In the meantime, I'll have a full accounting ready that no judge can dismiss. Something so clean and cross-referenced that if he tries to let Perrin off, he'll have to explain to the entire county how a widow from Philadelphia can read an account book better than his court can. Cletus looked at Wade. Wade looked back at him with an expression that said they were both thinking the same thing. She really was running a boarding house, Cletus said, as if confirming something. For 18 years, Margaret said, without looking up from the ledger. And before that I kept accounts for my father's mill. I have been doing this since I was 16 years old, and I am very tired of people being surprised by it. The following days settled into a shape that none of them had quite planned. Margaret rose first, made coffee, worked until the light went. She was not tireless. There were afternoons when she sat in the chair by the south window for half an hour and didn't do anything, just rested. And Wade noticed she never tried to hide these moments or explain them away. She simply rested when she needed to and then got back up, which struck him as a sane relationship with one's own limits that he had never quite managed to develop himself. She and Cletus reached a particular understanding that happened without discussion. He had 40 years of knowing this land and its rhythms and the specific stubbornness of Montana weather. She had accounting and organizational systems and the ability to see patterns in numbers that he couldn't. Between those two sets of knowledge, there was very little the ranch needed that they couldn't figure out. They argued occasionally, in the way that people argue when they both have opinions, and neither is inclined toward automatic deference. And the arguments were always about something specific and were always resolved by whoever had the better information on the actual question. Wade watched this develop and said very little, which was his preferred mode of response when things were going well. What was less simple were the evenings. Not bad evenings. The evenings were, in fact, the part of the day he found himself looking forward to with an anticipation that he was honest enough with himself to find startling. After supper, after Cletus went back to the bunkhouse, after the day's work was done and the stove was low, he and Margaret would sit at the kitchen table, or sometimes at the small table in the sitting room, and they would talk. They talked about practical things. They talked about what the ranch needed and what it could wait on and what order to address things in. They talked about the cattle prices and the condition of the south pasture and whether the well needed work before winter. These were the kinds of conversations he'd had with Clara years ago, before the winter of '77 had taken her and their boy in the space of 6 days and left him with the ranch and no understanding of how to fill the silence. But they also talked about other things, not always deliberately. It would happen sideways in the way conversations find their deeper channels when both people are tired enough to have let their guards down. She told him one evening about the boarding house. Not the loss of it, she'd told him that already, but what it had been when it was still hers. She told him about the long table in the dining room where she'd seated 12 people for supper every night, a rotating cast of travelers and regulars and people in transition, and how she'd learned to read a room full of strangers and know which ones needed to be left alone and which ones were hungry for someone to notice them. "What kind of people?" he asked. "All kinds. That was the thing about a boarding house. You didn't choose your community, it chose itself." She was looking at the lamp, not at him. There were men passing through on business, women who were in between one life and another, families that had more people than their current circumstances could accommodate, young men coming west who'd never been further from home than the next county. A pause. "I liked that. The randomness of it. You never knew who was going to sit down at your table. Do you miss it?" She thought about that honestly, which he'd come to expect. She didn't give quick answers to real questions. "I miss feeling like I was somewhere I'd built," she said. The specific people I miss less than you'd think. People move on. That's the nature of a boarding house. You learn not to attach too hard to the passing ones. She turned her eyes from the lamp to her hands. It was the permanence I miss, the sense that the work I did yesterday was still there the next day. He understood that. He understood it from a different direction, from building rather than losing. But he understood the thing she was describing, the specific value of work that accumulated rather than disappeared. "Robert," he said carefully, "your husband, was it a good marriage?" She looked at him with an expression that was considering whether to answer simply or honestly, and chose honestly. "It was a decent marriage," she said. "Robert was a decent man. He wasn't unkind, and he worked hard, and he never made me feel that I'd been foolish to trust him." She paused. "But we didn't have what I would have called a great understanding of each other. We managed together well. We were practical partners." She tilted her head slightly. "Is that a terrible thing to say about a man who is dead?" "No," Wade said. "It's a true thing. That's different." "What about your wife?" she asked, and there was something careful in the question, the care of someone who has identified a place that might be tender and is not trying to press it, just acknowledging it exists. He was quiet for long enough that she might have thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Clara. Her name was Clara." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "It was not a decent marriage. It was a good one. The kind you don't know is rare until you don't have it anymore." Margaret didn't say she was sorry. He was grateful for that. He'd heard enough sorries in the year after Clara died to last the rest of his life. "She sounds like someone worth grieving properly," she said instead. She was. They sat with that for a moment, and the sitting with it was not uncomfortable. "Do you think," Margaret said slowly, "that a person can be grateful for something that was good and lost, and also want something else that's different and not a replacement, both at once?" He looked at her. She was asking a real question, not a test. She wasn't that kind of person, but a genuine inquiry into something she was working out for herself at the same time as she was asking him. "Yes," he said. "I think those are two separate places in a person. I think they can both be occupied." She nodded. She seemed to be filing that away rather than responding to it immediately. "Good," she said. "That's what I thought. I wanted to check." The first sign of real trouble came at the end of that first week. Wade had driven into Colburn to pick up some hardware supplies, and he'd left Margaret at the ranch, which had been her preference. She'd said she wanted to spend the morning measuring the barn roof sections that needed replacing so she could give him accurate dimensions before he ordered materials. He came back with the hardware and a look on his face that was not the look of a man who'd had a routine trip into town. He didn't say anything about it until Cletus had gone and supper was cleared, and then he set a folded newspaper on the table between them. It was the Colburn Courier, which came out twice a week and was read by everyone in the county who could read and some who had it read to them. On the inside page, a small column that ran under the heading of Community Notes, there was a paragraph. Margaret read it. The paragraph noted, in the arch and indirect style that allowed newspapers to be cruel without being technically libelous, that a certain local rancher had recently received a mail-order bride from Philadelphia, described as a woman of advanced years whose suitability for frontier life was being generously interpreted by the rancher in question. It went on to observe that the rancher's neighbors and friends were concerned for his welfare, given what some described as a hasty arrangement, and concluded with the suggestion that the community would be watching the situation with interest. Margaret put the paper down. "Who wrote that?" she asked. "Not a byline. They don't always put one." He was watching her face. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have left it where—" "No," she said. "I'd rather know." She pressed the edge of the paper flat with one finger. "This is the Voss woman's doing, or someone like her." He frowned. "Voss?" "I don't know the name specifically. I mean, the kind of woman who was talking at the train station. There's always one. She saw something she wanted to have opinions about, and she knows someone who knows someone." Margaret sat back. "It doesn't matter who specifically. What matters is what comes next." "Nothing has to come next," he said. "Wade." She looked at him directly. Something always comes next. The newspaper paragraph is the opening. It's meant to make you question yourself. If you don't respond to it in some visible way, it will be followed by something else. That's how these things work. He looked at the paper. What do you suggest? She considered. Right now? Nothing. We give them nothing to point at. We do the work, we're seen in town doing the work, and we don't react in ways that become the next story. She picked up the paper and folded it. But we need to be ready, because whoever put this in motion is not going to stop at a newspaper paragraph. She was right about that. She was right about it in a way that she probably wished she weren't, because she'd had more practice at being right about it than anyone should have had. 3 days later, a group of 4 women from the Ladies' Aid Society of Colburn arrived at the ranch in a buggy. They came nominally to welcome the new arrival. They brought a jar of preserves and a hand-knitted tea towel, which were the traditional offerings of a welcome visit. But their actual purpose was visible in the way they looked at the house when they arrived, the careful inventory of everything that could be observed, the particular kind of smile that has assessment behind it rather than warmth. Wade was out on the range. Margaret received them herself. She put on coffee, which she did not have to do, and set out what biscuits were available, which were from 2 days ago and not at their best. She sat across from them in the sitting room and answered their questions pleasantly and completely, and volunteered nothing they hadn't asked for. Their questions were careful and civilized and designed to expose vulnerability. How long had she known Mr. Granger? Had she spent time in Montana before? Did she have family who had concerns about her coming so far? Did she find the ranch? Here a significant pause. Adequate to what she'd expected. To each one, Margaret gave an answer that was accurate, unrevealing, and slightly longer than necessary. Long enough that by the time she finished, it was difficult to build a follow-up without making the underlying intention obvious. The woman who seemed to be leading this expedition was named Mrs. Caldwell. She was perhaps 60, solid built, with the bearing of a woman who managed her community the way some people manage territory. She had been watching Margaret through the entire visit with the particular attention of someone who is trying to locate a weakness and has not found it yet. At the end, when the coffee was finished and the unimpressive biscuits had been politely consumed, Mrs. Caldwell said, "It must be quite a change for you, Mrs. Whitmore, coming from Philadelphia, a city of that kind." "It is," Margaret said. "Do you find Montana, the territory specifically, do you find it suits you?" Margaret looked at her steadily. "I find that it requires a person to be useful," she said. "I find that very well." Mrs. Caldwell held her gaze for a moment. Then she smiled, and it was a real smile this time, which surprised Margaret. "Well," she said, "that's the right answer." After they left, Margaret sat in the sitting room for a few minutes without doing anything. Her hands were in her lap. Outside, she heard the buggy receding down the road, and then the particular wide quiet of the Montana range that was unlike any quiet she'd known before coming here, bigger than silence somehow, with the mountains always at the edge of it. She was tired in a way that was not about the physical work of the day. She was tired of being tested by people who had decided her value was a question rather than an assumption. She was tired of walking into rooms where she had to prove, before anything else was established, that she existed. But she was not so tired that she'd stopped. That was something, maybe the only thing. But she held on to it. When Wade came in that evening and asked how the visit had gone, she told him about it plainly, including the part she found offensive and the part at the end with Mrs. Caldwell, which she reported without editorial comment. He listened to all of it. Then he said, "Mrs. Caldwell is not a bad woman. She's protective of things in ways that sometimes come out sideways." "I gathered that," Margaret said. "I don't dislike her for it. I understand it." She looked at him. "What I need to know, Wade, is whether the town's opinion of me is going to matter to you, in a way that changes things." He didn't hesitate. "No. People will say things. They'll say things about the age difference, about where I came from, about whether you've made a mistake. People have been saying things about my decisions since I was 22 years old," he said. "It has never been a factor I found useful to manage my life around." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "All right, good." And she got up and started on the supper, which was her way of indicating that the matter was settled. But 2 days after that conversation, a letter arrived. It came through the post office in Colburn, forwarded from an address in Philadelphia, and the name on the return was one she recognized before she'd finished reading it, and she put the letter down on the table and pressed both hands flat against the surface and breathed carefully until the first response had passed. Wade was on the porch when she came out. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, "something I didn't think would follow me here." He turned from where he'd been looking at the horizon. She held out the letter. The handwriting on the outside was meticulous and slightly overdone. The handwriting of a man who had learned to make his penmanship impressive as a substitute for making his character trustworthy. H. Voss, Esquire, it read in the return corner. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Wade took it. He read the address. He looked up at her. "Tell me who he is," he said. She had hoped, in the part of her that still occasionally hoped for things she knew were unlikely, that distance would be enough. That 3,000 miles and a new name in a new place would be sufficient barrier between herself and the man who had spent 3 years ensuring she had nothing. She had known, in the larger and more experienced part of herself, that it wouldn't. "His name is Harlan Voss," she said. "He is Robert's cousin. He was the one who organized it. The forged documents, the legal proceedings, the campaign to convince the town I was unfit." Her voice was steady. She'd had 3 years to practice steadiness on this subject. "He lost track of me for a while after I left Philadelphia. I thought—" She stopped. "I hoped he had simply moved on to other business." "What does the letter say?" She had read it twice, quickly, standing at the kitchen table. "It says he has become aware of my current location. It says he wishes to inform me that there are outstanding legal matters regarding the boarding house estate that have been, in his words, incorrectly resolved, and that he expects to be in contact with authorities in Montana to clarify certain outstanding questions of property and conduct." Wade was quiet for a long moment. The wind off the mountain range came across the yard and lifted the corner of the letter he was holding, and he pressed it flat with his thumb. "He's going to come here," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said, "he's going to come here." And in the distance, as if timed to that admission, the sound of a train whistle reached them from the direction of Colburn. Faint, carried on the mountain wind, the sound of something coming that was still too far away to see. Wade read Harlan Voss's letter twice, standing on the porch with the mountain wind at his back, and then he folded it along its original creases and handed it back to Margaret with the particular deliberateness of a man who is deciding something while his hands are still busy with something else. "Tell me everything," he said. "Not the summary. Everything." She had been expecting that question since the moment she'd seen the return address, and she'd been dreading it for a different reason than he might have assumed. Not because she was hiding anything further. She had told him the essential facts the first night at the kitchen table over cooling coffee. She dreaded it because telling the whole story meant reliving the specific texture of those 3 years, the particular quality of humiliation that came not from one large blow, but from 100 small ones accumulated until they had the weight of something permanent. But he was asking, and he had a right to ask, and she was not going to be the woman who withheld information from the person standing beside her when the person she'd withheld it from before had used that absence of information against her. They went inside. She sat at the kitchen table, and he sat across from her, and she told him. Harlan Voss was not Robert's cousin by blood. He was the son of Robert's mother's second husband, which made him technically a step relation and practically a stranger for most of Robert's life. He had appeared on their doorstep in Philadelphia 12 years before Robert died, presenting himself as family reconnecting, and Robert, who was a generous man with few natural defenses against charm, had welcomed him. Margaret had not trusted Harlan from the first month. She could not have articulated then exactly why. It was something in the way his attention moved, she'd thought at the time, something in how he watched situations rather than inhabiting them, always calculating where the advantage was before deciding how to behave. She had said this to Robert once, carefully, and Robert had told her she was being uncharitable to someone who hadn't done anything wrong yet. She had let it go. It was the thing she most regretted now, not that she'd been wrong about Harlan, but that she'd let it go rather than pressing harder. Harlan had made himself useful over the years that followed. He'd done small tasks, carried messages, handled minor errands. He'd positioned himself as helpful without ever being indispensable, which she understood in retrospect was deliberate. Indispensable people get scrutinized, useful people get trusted. When Robert became ill, Harlan became more present. He visited frequently. He sat with Robert during evenings when Margaret was managing the boarding house. He had, she had assumed then, been providing companionship during a difficult time. What he had been doing, she understood later, was positioning himself as the most trusted person in the room during the period when Robert was least capable of scrutinizing what he was told. Robert died in March of 1880. Within 2 weeks, Harlan had presented documents to the county court claiming that Robert, in the final months of his illness, had expressed wishes regarding the property that he'd never communicated to Margaret, documents with Robert's signature, or what looked like Robert's signature, close enough that a court without reason to look carefully had accepted it. "I hired a lawyer," she told Wade, "a young man, fresh admitted to the bar. He was the only one who would take the case on a contingency because I had no money for a retainer. The accounts had been frozen pending the property dispute." She paused. "He tried. I want to be fair to him. He tried, and he was not experienced enough, and Harlan had been preparing this for longer than any of us understood. And the judge who heard the initial filing was a man who had known the Voss family for 30 years. She pressed the letter flat on the table with one hand. "The property transferred. The boarding house transferred. The savings account that Robert and I had held jointly for 17 years transferred, on the basis of documents that said Robert had intended it for family management after his death." "And the story about your mental fitness?" Wade said. "That came after." Her voice stayed level, but he could hear the effort in the levelness. "When I contested the transfer, when I went to the newspaper and told them what had happened, Harlan went to the same newspaper the following week and told them that I was a woman in grief who had become confused about the terms of my late husband's estate, and that the family was very concerned about my well-being, and that they hoped I would accept assistance before my condition deteriorated further." She looked at her hands on the table. "He was very careful with the language. He never said I was insane. He said I was confused. He said he was worried about me. He said grief did things to women of a certain age, and people receive that information the way they receive anything that confirms something they already half believed." "That older women lose their grip," Wade said. "That older women lose their grip," she agreed. "It's a very old story. It doesn't require evidence. It just requires someone credible to suggest it. And suddenly everything I said became reframed as the confusion of a grieving widow rather than the accurate account of a woman who had been robbed." She stopped. She'd said the essential thing, and she didn't want to continue past it into the territory of self-pity, which she found useless and which she couldn't afford anyway, not with Harlan's letter sitting on the table between them. Wade was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at the letter. "He's not coming about the property," he said. "No. He got what he wanted 3 years ago. He's coming because he found out you have something again." She met his eyes. "Yes, that's who he is. He doesn't need more than he has. He just can't tolerate me having anything at all." The word for that existed, and they both knew it without saying it, because saying it out loud would have required acknowledging the kind of human being they were dealing with, and acknowledging it fully was like pressing on a bruise, true and necessary, and not pleasant. Wade stood up. He went to the window and stood there for a moment with his back to her, looking at the yard, the barn, the mountains. She waited. "All right," he said. "All right, what?" He turned around. "All right, he's coming, so we prepare." She had expected more reaction than that, more visible anger, more of the man who'd sent for a wife from Philadelphia performing some version of protectiveness that was really about him rather than about her. What she got instead was the face of someone who had already moved past the thing he felt about the situation and into the practical question of what needed to be done. It was, she thought, one of the most useful things she had ever seen a person do. "The circuit judge," she said. "Due in about 2 weeks, I know. We need everything documented and organized before he arrives. Everything about the original transfer, every piece of correspondence I have, whatever legal records I was able to bring with me." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "I brought some things. Not everything. I had to leave Philadelphia with very little and very quickly. But I have copies of the original boarding house deed. I have letters from Robert predating his illness that establish his actual intentions regarding the property. I have 3 years of account records, that directly contradict the version Harlan presented to the court. She paused. It is not enough to win a legal case on its own, but it is enough to establish that there is a real question that a legitimate court should hear. Do you know a lawyer? He asked. Not out here. I might. He moved to the door and called for Cletus, who appeared from the direction of the barn with the expression of a man who has been doing something and been interrupted, which was usually the expression Cletus wore. Do you remember that fellow who helped the Brennan family with their land title? Wade asked him. 2 winters ago. Cletus thought. Edmund Pyle? He's in Helena, I think. Maybe further. County seat. Can you get a message to him? I can get a message to him, Cletus said. He looked at Margaret, then at Wade, then back at Margaret. He'd assessed the situation from the 2 sentences he'd heard and the letter visible on the table and arrived at a working conclusion without being told. That was one of Cletus's genuine qualities. You want me to go today? Tomorrow morning, Wade said. Tonight I need to sit with Margaret and go through what she has. After Cletus went back to the barn, Margaret looked at Wade across the kitchen and said, You don't have to do this. He looked at her with an expression that was not angry, but that was emphatic in a way that didn't require volume. We settled that the first night, he said. Don't unsettled it. She hadn't been testing him. She'd been giving him the genuine option because she believed in genuine options. But she was glad he'd declined it. They spent the evening going through the documents she'd brought in the worn leather suitcase. She'd kept them wrapped in an oilcloth packet at the bottom, under her winter clothes, and she laid them on the kitchen table one by one with the care of someone handling things that were fragile not physically, but in some other way, things whose value could not be replaced if lost. The deed to the boarding house, original, with both her name and Robert's. Letters from Robert to his brother from 1876, predating the illness by 4 years, in which he clearly expressed his wish that the boarding house remain Margaret's property in the event of his death. A full set of account books from the boarding house going back 12 years, in her handwriting, irrefutably demonstrating that the property had been managed competently and profitably throughout their marriage. A copy of the county record from Philadelphia, showing the date the documents Harlan had produced were supposedly signed, a date when Robert had been, Margaret had recorded in her household diary, running a fever of 103 degrees and was barely coherent. That diary, Wade said when she showed him the entry. Does the date match the signature date on the documents Harlan filed? Within 4 days. He looked at her. You kept household diaries? I have kept a household diary since I was 23 years old, she said. I have never missed a day. Robert used to tease me about it. Something crossed her face briefly that she let pass. I have the diaries from those months in Philadelphia, everything I observed during Robert's illness, his condition each day, who visited, what was discussed that I was present for, what medications the doctor prescribed. She folded her hands on the table. Harlan was present on 12 specific occasions during the final 2 months of Robert's life. I documented every visit. I documented what I saw him doing, which twice included sitting with Robert alone when Robert was not lucid and leaving with papers under his arm. Wade sat back. He looked at the table covered in documents and considered the woman who had gathered and preserved every piece of this, while simultaneously being publicly characterized as confused and unfit and deteriorating. You were building a case, he said. I was recording what I saw, she said. I didn't know yet that it would become a case. She stopped. I have kept records because records are how you prove that your version of events is accurate. I've believed that since I was young. I didn't do it strategically. I did it because it's how I've always operated. She looked at the pile of documents. It turned out to be useful. He thought that was probably the single most understated thing she had ever said. The next morning, Cletus left before dawn for the county seat with a letter addressed to one Edmund Pyle, attorney at law, explaining the situation in broad terms and requesting an urgent consultation. Wade paid for the telegraph Cletus would send first, before the letter, so that Pyle would be expecting them. The waiting was the hardest part, and it was also the most dangerous part, because waiting gave the town time to do what towns do with a story that hadn't yet been resolved, fill in the unwritten parts themselves. Harlan Voss arrived on a Tuesday. Wade knew he was in Colburn before he saw him, because Colburn was the kind of town where news traveled faster than the person it was about. Doyle came in from town that afternoon with supplies and the information, delivered with the discomfort of someone who knows they're bringing bad news, that a man from Philadelphia had arrived on the midday train and gone directly to the sheriff's office. Margaret was in the kitchen when Doyle told them. She didn't change her expression. "What did he look like?" she asked. Doyle blinked. "Ma'am?" "The man from Philadelphia. What did he look like?" Well-dressed, expensive suit, had a gold watch chain. Older man, maybe 60, 65. Real," Doyle searched for the word. "Real confident. Like he knew he owned whatever room he was in." Margaret nodded once. "That's Harlan." She turned back to the counter and continued what she'd been doing, which was working through the ranch's monthly accounts. Wade watched her for a moment. He had expected some visible response, some fracture in the composure she usually maintained, and the absence of it told him something that the presence of it would not have. She had been expecting this for longer than 2 weeks. She had been expecting it at some level since the moment she'd stepped off the train in Colburn. Maybe since before that. Maybe she had known from the moment she'd decided to try again for a life that Harlan Voss would eventually appear on whatever horizon she chose, because that was who he was, and that was what he did, and she had stopped being surprised by it the second time it happened. Wade drove into Colburn the next morning. He left before Margaret was up, which was early enough that it was still dark. He left a note on the kitchen table. "Gone to town, back by noon." Which was not the full accounting of where he was going and why, but it was accurate. He found Harlan Voss at the Colburn Hotel, eating breakfast in the dining room with the unhurried ease of a man who had no doubt that the day's business would go in his favor. He was exactly as Doyle had described, well-dressed, older, the kind of man whose bearing carried the assumption of deference the way some people's clothing carries a smell. Wade sat down across from him without being invited. Harlan Voss looked up from his plate with the expression of someone who is surprised but does not want to admit it, which on his face looked like mild interest. "Mr. Granger," he said. He had found out Wade's name, which was not surprising. He'd have made it his business to know everything available about the territory he was entering. "I wondered when you'd come." "Yesterday," Wade said, "but I wanted to sleep on my temper first." Harlan smiled. It was a good smile. Practiced, warm-looking, the smile of someone who had used it successfully for decades. "That's a wise approach. I appreciate a man who thinks before he acts." He set down his fork. "I imagine Margaret has told you her version of events." "She's told me the events," Wade said. "Whether there's another version worth hearing is what I'm here to find out." "There are always two sides to a legal matter." "There are always two sides to an argument," Wade said. "Legal matters are supposed to be about what's true." Harlan regarded him across the table with the assessing look of someone recalibrating. He had been expecting, Wade guessed, less directness. He had been expecting the straightforward frontier man who would be managed by the appearance of legal authority and the confidence of a Philadelphia businessman. "Mr. Granger," he said, "I have documents filed with the Philadelphia County Court establishing clearly that Margaret mismanaged the estate in the period following my cousin's death, that she caused significant financial harm to the estate, and that there are outstanding questions of property transfer that were never properly resolved. I am here to ensure those questions are addressed through the appropriate legal channels in this territory." "What outstanding questions?" "The question of certain personal property belonging to the estate that Margaret appears to have removed without authorization when she left Philadelphia." Wade was quiet for a moment. He looked at Harlan with the steady, unhurried attention of a man who has spent a great deal of time reading terrain and weather and livestock and has learned to distrust anything that looks too composed. "What property?" he said. Harlan produced a folded document from his breast pocket and laid it on the table. Wade picked it up. It was a list, a long list, of household items, account books, personal documents, and correspondence described as belonging to the estate of Robert Whitmore, currently in the unauthorized possession of one Margaret Whitmore. Wade read down the list. Near the bottom, he stopped. He read the entry again. Household diaries and personal records, comprising 18 volumes, property of the Whitmore estate, removal constituting unauthorized appropriation of estate assets. He set the document down. He looked at Harlan Voss, who was watching him with the careful attention of someone who has laid a trap and is watching the other person step toward it, And Wade understood in that moment exactly what this was about. Not the boarding house, not the property, not any of it. Harlan Voss had come 3,000 miles to get those diaries. Because the diaries documented what he'd done. Because in Margaret's careful daily handwriting, across 18 volumes kept since she was 23 years old, was the record of every visit Harlan had made during Robert's illness. Every document he'd removed, every day in detail that contradicted his account of events. He hadn't known they existed until Margaret had tried to use them to contest the property transfer, and by then she was already being characterized as confused and unreliable, and no one had been willing to look at the evidence she was offering. But in front of a circuit court judge who hadn't already been managed by Harlan's preparations, those diaries could do real damage. So Harlan had reclassified them as estate property. And if he could get a Montana sheriff to compel their return as stolen assets, they would disappear into his possession and never be seen again. Wade stood up. "I'll let our attorney respond to that," he said. Something shifted in Harlan's expression. "Your attorney?" "We have one," Wade said. He had not confirmed this until this morning, when a telegraph reply from Edmund Pyle had arrived saying he would be in Colburn within 4 days. "He'll be in contact." He picked up his hat from the table. "I'd suggest you settle in, Mr. Voss. You may be here a while." He left Harlan Voss at his breakfast table and walked back out into the Colburn morning, and the anger he'd told him he'd slept on was still there. He hadn't slept it off entirely, but it was a useful kind of anger now. The kind that made him think more clearly rather than less. He was home by 11. Margaret was measuring the barn roof sections as she'd planned, calling dimensions down to Doyle, who was writing them on a board. She climbed down from the ladder when Wade came into the yard, and she read his face the way she'd been reading people's faces for 30 years. "He's after the diaries," she said. "He's claiming they're estate property." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Of course he is." She handed the measuring tape to Doyle with a word of thanks, and she and Wade walked toward the house. "He tried that in Philadelphia. The young lawyer I had caught it in time to contest it, but by then the transfer had already gone through and there was nothing to contest it against." She pushed the kitchen door open. "He knows what's in them." "Does he know exactly?" "No. He knows I documented the visits. He doesn't know the specific level of detail." She sat down and looked at the table. "I was very detailed." "Tell me the worst entry," Wade said. "The one that would do the most damage if it came in front of a judge." She didn't have to think about it. The 14th of January, 1880. Harlan arrived at 2 in the afternoon. Robert was having a bad day. Fever was up. He didn't recognize me clearly when I came in to check on him at noon. Harlan asked me to give them privacy, which he said was because Robert wanted to discuss something personal and was embarrassed to speak in front of me. She folded her hands on the table. I went to the kitchen. After perhaps 20 minutes, I went back to check on Robert because his fever worried me. The sitting room door was not fully closed. I could see through the gap. Harlan had papers on the side table. Robert had a pen in his hand. Robert's hand was shaking. I could not see what was on the papers. She paused. I noted exactly what I saw. I noted the time, the condition of the pen afterward. I found it on the side table when Harlan had gone and it had been used. And I noted that when I asked Robert afterward what they'd discussed, he didn't remember the visit at all. The silence in the kitchen was the particular silence of something important having been said. "He didn't remember the visit," Wade said. "He was not lucid. He had not been reliably lucid for a week before that, and he was not reliably lucid for 2 weeks after." She met Wade's eyes. The documents Harlan filed with the court list the 14th of January as one of the dates Robert allegedly expressed his wishes regarding the property. His signature, or what Harlan claimed was his signature, appeared on a document dated that day. Wade sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. "We need Pyle here before Voss goes to the sheriff again," he said. 4 days is too long." "I know." "Is there anyone in Colburn, any lawyer at all, even someone who practices occasionally?" Wade thought. "There's a man named Garrett who drafted the Henderson land agreement last spring. He's not a full-time attorney. He's more of a... He does what needs doing legally when there's no one else." "Can you trust him?" "I trust him enough. Get him today," she said. "Tell him what we have and what we're up against. Tell him we need someone to file an objection to any sheriff's action before Pyle arrives." She was already reaching for the ledger. "I'll have everything organized and summarized by the time you get back." He stood up, then paused. "Margaret." She looked up. "I need to know one thing," he said. "Everything you've told me. About Harlan, about Robert, about the documents. Is there anything else? Anything you haven't said because you thought it might change how I see things?" She held his gaze. "No," she said. "There is nothing else." He nodded once. "All right." He picked up his hat. "Lock the door while I'm gone." She looked at him. "I haven't locked a door in 3 years." "Lock it anyway." After he left, she sat at the table and opened the account book and did not lock the door, because she was not going to start managing her life around Harlan Voss's proximity, and because she was also, honestly, too angry now to be particularly afraid. The anger was new, or not new. It had been there for 3 years, buried under the accumulated weight of having nowhere useful to put it. But here, on Wade's ranch with the mountains outside the window and the October light coming through the south pane and the smell of work and practical purpose in the air, the anger had somewhere to stand. It had ground under it. She worked for 2 hours documenting everything, the cross-referenced accounts, the timeline from the diaries, the specific entries that contradicted Harlan's narrative. She organized it all with the clear methodical attention she'd applied to the account books, to the pantry shelves, to the measurements for the barn roof. The attention of a woman who had been told she couldn't think straight and had responded to that accusation by thinking more carefully than anyone around her. She was still working when she heard the horses in the yard. Not Wade. He'd taken the wagon, and the sound was different, faster. She went to the window. 2 riders. She didn't recognize either of them. They came into the yard at the kind of pace that wasn't quite threatening but wasn't casual, and they stopped near the porch, and one of them called out, "Mrs. Whitmore?" She did not open the door. "Mrs. Whitmore, we have a communication from the Sheriff's Office of Colburn County." A pause. "Sheriff Holt requests your presence in town at your earliest convenience regarding a legal matter." She stood at the window, her hand flat on the wall beside it. Your earliest convenience. That was Harlan's language, not a Montana sheriff's. Harlan had already been to see Sheriff Holt, and Holt, who played cards with Jonas Perrin, and who had responded to a documented $200 theft with the enthusiasm of a man walking toward something he'd rather not touch, had sent riders to her instead of handling it himself. She looked at the documents spread across the kitchen table. She looked at the riders in the yard. She thought about the man in the Philadelphia hotel who had once told her neighbor that she was a confused woman who needed help she was too proud to accept, and how that neighbor had looked at her afterward with a particular mixture of pity and distance that was worse than open hostility. She pulled her coat from the hook by the door. She put the oilcloth packet of documents inside it, against her ribs, and she opened the door. "Tell Sheriff Holt," she said to the riders in a voice that didn't require raising, "that I will be in town within the hour, and that he should ensure that Mr. Voss is present when I arrive, because what I have to say is for both of them to hear." One rider looked at the other, then he nodded. She went back inside, gathered the rest of the organized documents from the table, and left a note for Wade that said, "Gone to the sheriff's office. Don't panic. Bring Garrett if you find him." She hitched her own horse, she had learned in the past 2 weeks, with Doyle's patient instruction, to do it adequately if not expertly. And she rode toward Colburn in the October afternoon with the mountains at her back and 3 years of accumulated evidence pressed against her chest. And she did not let herself think about what would happen if the sheriff had already decided. And she did not let herself think about how outnumbered she was. And she did not let herself think about anything except what she knew and how clearly she could say it. She had been told she couldn't think straight. She intended to prove otherwise, one more time, in front of witnesses who had not yet made up their minds about her. She rode toward the town, and the afternoon light was long and cold on the Montana plain, and the train whistle from the station reached her on the wind, and she registered it the way you register a sound that has no particular significance until later, when everything has changed, and you remember that it was there. The Colburn Sheriff's Office was a single-room building with a wood stove that was always either too hot or not lit. And on this particular afternoon it was too hot, which made the room feel smaller than it was, and the situation feel more compressed than Margaret needed it to feel. Sheriff Holt was a man of perhaps 55 who had the look of someone who had once been capable and had been gradually worn down by the gap between what he'd imagined the job would require and what it actually required day to day. He sat behind his desk with the posture of a man who would rather be anywhere else, and Harlan Voss sat in the chair to the right of the desk with the posture of a man who was exactly where he wanted to be. There were two other men in the room that Margaret didn't recognize. One appeared to be a clerk of some kind with a writing board on his lap. The other was older, well-dressed for Colburn, and sat with the stillness of someone who was there to observe rather than participate. Margaret came in and shut the door behind her and did not sit down. Holt looked relieved to see her, which she found interesting. A man expecting an easy proceeding didn't look relieved when the opposing party arrived. He looked prepared. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Thank you for coming in." "You sent writers to my home," she said pleasantly. "I didn't experience it as optional." Harlan smiled from his chair. He had changed from his breakfast clothes into something slightly more formal, which told her he'd planned this for this afternoon and had dressed for it. He was staging a performance, and the staging was important to him. That was useful to know. "Margaret," he said, as if they were old friends, "I'm glad you came. I'd hoped we could resolve this without difficulty." "Then you should have stayed in Philadelphia," she said. Holt cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Voss has presented the office with certain legal documents from the Philadelphia County Court regarding property matters pertaining to the estate of one Robert Whitmore." He picked up a paper from the desk and looked at it with the expression of a man reading something in a language he only partially speaks. "These documents establish a claim that certain personal property, specifically account books and personal diary volumes, were removed from the estate without authorization and are currently in your possession." "They are in my possession," she said. "They are my property." "Mr. Voss has documents that suggest otherwise." "Mr. Voss has documents that say otherwise," she said. "I made a distinction there deliberately." She reached inside her coat and produced the oilcloth packet. "I also have documents, including the original deed to the boarding house with my name on it alongside my husband's, including letters from my husband predating his illness establishing his clearly stated wishes, including account books in my handwriting spanning 12 years of operation that directly contradict every claim Mr. Voss has made regarding mismanagement." She set the packet on the desk. Holt looked at it. He looked at Harlan. He looked at Margaret. Harlan said, "Margaret, those documents were in a property that was legally transferred. Whatever was inside that property at the time of transfer, the diaries were not inside the boarding house at the time of transfer," she said. "The diaries were in my room, my personal room, in a trunk that contained my clothing and personal effects, which I removed before I left Philadelphia because they were mine." She kept her voice even. "I have kept a household diary since I was 23 years old. These volumes predate my marriage. They predate the boarding house. Claiming them as estate property is not a legal argument. It is an attempt to access records that would be inconvenient for Mr. Voss if placed before an impartial court." The room was quiet. The clerk was writing. The older man who had been sitting still was no longer quite so still. Holt said carefully, "Ma'am, I'm not in a position to adjudicate the competing claims here. What Mr. Voss is asking is that I compel the production of the documents pending a proper legal review." "Sheriff." She turned her full attention to him, and there was something in the quality of that attention that made him sit slightly straighter without deciding to. "If you issue a compulsory order for the production of those diaries, they will leave this territory in Mr. Voss's possession within 24 hours and will never be seen again. We both know that. I am asking you to consider whether that is the outcome you want your name associated with." Holt opened his mouth, closed it. Harlan said, "Margaret, you're being dramatic." "I am being accurate," she said. "There's a difference, and you've spent 3 years hoping people can't tell them apart." Something happened in Harlan's expression then, a small, controlled tightening around the eyes. That was the only sign she'd ever been able to read on him that indicated she'd gotten through. He was not angry. He didn't do angry where it could be seen. But she'd found the edge of something. "I have a legal instrument from a sitting Philadelphia judge," he said, and his voice was still smooth, still reasonable, still the voice of a man explaining something obvious to someone who doesn't want to understand. "Sheriff Holt has a professional obligation to honor that instrument." The circuit judge for this territory is due in Colburn in 2 weeks, Margaret said. I am asking Sheriff Holt to wait 2 weeks before taking any compulsory action and to allow the matter to be heard by the appropriate court for this jurisdiction. She looked at Holt. That is a reasonable request. If Mr. Voss's claim is legitimate, it will survive 2 weeks of scrutiny. If he is unwilling to wait for legitimate scrutiny, that tells you something. Harlan said, I have business in Philadelphia that can't. Then go back to Philadelphia, she said. File your claim through proper channels, and the court will contact me through our attorney. She paused. We have an attorney. He arrives in 3 days. It was the second time she'd mentioned the attorney, and she watched it land differently this time. In their first conversation the previous morning, Wade had mentioned Pyle to Harlan as a fact being established. Now she was confirming it as something already in motion, and Harlan recalculated. She could see him do it. That was the particular thing about Harlan. He was intelligent enough to recalculate, which made him more dangerous than a man who simply pushed harder when he met resistance. But it also meant that when his calculations changed, you could see the adjustment happen if you were watching for it. He had come to Colburn expecting to find a woman who was alone, a woman who had fled to the frontier with nothing and had not yet had time to establish anything. He had expected a sheriff who would be easy to leverage in a town that had no particular investment in protecting a stranger. He had not expected an attorney. He had not expected documented accounts. And he had not, she thought, expected her to walk into the sheriff's office and put her own evidence on the desk before he could frame the conversation. He was recalculating, and the recalculation was showing her that his position was less certain than he'd presented it. The older man in the corner spoke for the first time. Sheriff, he said, I think a 2-week delay for proper judicial review is a reasonable request from Mrs. Whitmore. I would recommend honoring it. Holt looked at him with evident relief at having a direction pointed out to him. Yes, I think that's the appropriate course. Harlan turned to look at the older man with the expression of someone who is reconfiguring who is in the room. I don't believe we've been introduced, he said. My name is Thaddeus Crane, the man said. He produced a card from his jacket and held it out. I represent several land and property interests in this territory, and I happen to be in Colburn on other business. I make it a habit to observe matters of legal interest. He looked at Harlan with a calm, specific attention. I have now observed this one. Harlan took the card. He looked at it. Something shifted in his face. Margaret did not know who Thaddeus Crane was, but something in the room had changed when he said his name, and the change had not been in her favor or in Holt's favor, but specifically in the direction of Harlan being less comfortable, which meant Crane was someone whose observation Harlan had reason to care about. She filed that away. Holt said the matter would be held pending the circuit judge's arrival, and the meeting ended with the particular awkwardness of a confrontation that hadn't resolved into anything clean. No winner declared, no clear loss suffered, just a temporary pause in which both sides went back to their corners to think. She was walking out to her horse when she heard her name. She turned. Crane had followed her out. Mrs. Whitmore, he said. A moment, if you'll permit. She looked at him. He was perhaps 65 with the unhurried quality of a man who was accustomed to having time for things. Who are you? She asked, because there was no point in circling it. I told you in there. You told me your name and that you represent property interests. That's not who you are. He almost smiled. I'm a man who has been aware of Harlan Voss for considerably longer than you might imagine. He has operated in several territories over the past decade, and the pattern of his operations has come to the attention of people whose business it is to notice such patterns. He paused. The boarding house in Philadelphia was not the first time he used forged documents to transfer property from a legitimate owner. It was simply the first time the legitimate owner was persistent enough to document what happened. She stood very still. What are you saying? She said. I'm saying that you are not the only person with evidence of Harlan Voss's methods. He looked at her steadily. I am saying that when the circuit judge arrives, it may be that what is presented in that courtroom is considerably more than what you have in that packet. She processed this. You have evidence. There are people who have evidence, he said carefully. Whether that evidence arrives in Colburn in time to be useful is a question I cannot answer definitively today. He reached into his jacket and produced a card, his own card, not the one he'd given Harlan, and handed it to her. Your attorney should contact me when he arrives. She took the card. She looked at him. Why? She said. Why are you doing this? He was quiet for a moment. Because in a territory that is still deciding what kind of place it's going to be, it matters what behavior is permitted to succeed. He picked up his hat. And because I knew Robert Whitmore briefly, 20 years ago before he met you, he was a good man who didn't deserve what was done to his name after his death. He put the hat on. Good afternoon, Mrs. Whitmore. He walked back into the sheriff's office, and Margaret stood on the board sidewalk of Colburn's main street with his card in her hand and 3 years of accumulated solitude beginning very slowly and cautiously to open in a direction she hadn't known was available. She was still standing there when Wade's wagon came down the street at a pace that suggested he had read her note and had not, in fact, not panicked. He pulled up and took in her expression and then the card in her hand. Are you all right? He said. Surprisingly, she said. Yes. She told him everything on the ride back to the ranch. He listened without interrupting, which she'd come to understand was not passivity, but the active attention of a man who needed to understand something fully before he responded to it. When she finished, he said, Crane. You know him? Of him. He's a land commissioner, appointed by the territorial government. He oversees property disputes across 3 counties. He was looking at the road. If he has evidence against Voss that goes beyond your case, and he's willing to present it, he was careful not to promise that. He was careful not to promise it in public, Wade said. He gave you his card. She looked at the card again. Yes. A man who gives you his card after being careful in public is telling you something different than what he said out loud. She thought about that. It was the kind of observation that came from a lifetime of dealing with people in situations where what was said and what was meant occupied different rooms, and it was, she thought, one of the more useful things about Wade Granger. He had learned to read the distance between those rooms. We still need Pyle, she said. Pyle arrives day after tomorrow. I got a second telegraph confirmation before I came to find you. She nodded. She put the card inside the oilcloth packet with her other documents and looked out at the road ahead, the late afternoon coming off the mountains in long, cold shadows. What did Harlan do after I left? She asked. What? In the sheriff's office, after I rode out. Did anyone tell you what he did? Wade was quiet for a moment. Doyle was in town. He saw Voss come out of the sheriff's office about 20 minutes after you left. Said he looked contained. The way a man looks when he's had a setback, he's not going to acknowledge. He's recalculating, she said. He came here with one approach, and it didn't work the way he expected. Now he's deciding on the next one. What do you think the next one is? She considered. He'll go to the town, not the sheriff. He's gotten everything he's going to get from the sheriff without a judge's backing. He'll go to the people. The way he went to my neighbors in Philadelphia, the way he went to the newspaper. She folded her hands in her lap. He'll tell a story about me that makes him the reasonable party and me the problem. He's very good at that. This isn't Philadelphia, Wade said. He doesn't know these people. He doesn't need to know them. He needs to know what they already half believe about me. She looked at him. What do they half believe, Wade? After the newspaper column, after the Ladies' Aid Society visit, after watching me cry on a train platform the first day I arrived. He didn't answer immediately, and the honesty of not answering immediately was its own kind of answer. They're uncertain, he said. Some of them, not all. Uncertainty is enough, she said. That's all he needs. She was right, and the confirmation of it came the following morning. She had gone into Colburn herself. She needed thread from the dry goods store, which was a genuine errand, not an excuse, though it also gave her reason to be seen in town going about ordinary business, which she'd decided was important. She tied her horse outside Keller's dry goods and went in, and Mrs. Caldwell was there at the counter. They had reached a kind of understanding after the Ladies' Aid Society visit. Not warmth. Margaret was not under the impression that Mrs. Caldwell had become her advocate, but a mutual recognition of the other person as someone worth taking seriously, which in a small town was a currency that could be spent. Mrs. Caldwell looked at her with an expression that was doing something complicated. Mrs. Whitmore, she said. Mrs. Caldwell. Margaret asked for her thread. While old Keller was finding it, she waited at the counter and felt the quality of the silence in the store, which had 3 other women in it and was too quiet for a room with that many people. When Keller had gone to the back storeroom to look, Mrs. Caldwell said quietly, "You should know that there was a man at the church hall last evening." Margaret said nothing. She waited. "A Mr. Voss, from Philadelphia. He presented himself as a representative of your late husband's family. He said—" Mrs. Caldwell paused, and in the pause was the discomfort of someone who doesn't enjoy being the messenger of something unpleasant. "He said there were questions about your conduct after your husband's death. He said the family was concerned about you and had followed you out of concern for your well-being, not to cause trouble." She looked at Margaret directly. He was very convincing. He had the manner of someone who was pained by the necessity of what he was doing. "He always does," Margaret said. He told the group there were perhaps 15 people. It was a general community gathering. He told them that there were legal documents establishing that you had removed property from the estate. He said he had tried to resolve it privately, but that you had refused to cooperate. Mrs. Caldwell's jaw was set. Several people were sympathetic to him. "Which people?" Mrs. Caldwell named 2. Margaret didn't know them. She noted the names. "What did you make of him?" she asked. The older woman considered. "I thought he was too smooth," she said. "A man who is genuinely pained doesn't perform it that well." She looked at Margaret with the assessing territorial attention that had been unsettling on the first visit and was now recognizable as something else. The attention of a woman who has protected her community for decades and is deciding what protecting it requires in this instance. "I thought he was the kind of man I have encountered twice before in my life, and have regretted not recognizing sooner both times." "What kind is that?" "The kind that dresses up self-interest as concern." Mrs. Caldwell straightened. "I didn't say that to anyone else last night. I am saying it to you now." Keller came back with the thread. Margaret paid. She looked at Mrs. Caldwell. "Thank you," she said. "I mean that specifically, not generally." Mrs. Caldwell nodded once. "The circuit judge is due in a fortnight." 11 days now. "Then you have 11 days to make sure the right story is the loudest one in this town." She picked up her own parcel from the counter. "I am not promising anything beyond this conversation, but I'm a woman who doesn't like being told something that doesn't add up and being expected to swallow it without question." She left. Margaret stood at the counter for a moment with her thread in her hand. Keller, who was not an unkind man and who had seen a great deal in 40 years of running a dry goods store, said, "That man was here too, earlier this morning, bought some tobacco." "Did he say anything?" "He asked me how long you'd been in Colburn." Keller kept his eyes on his countertop. "I told him I didn't make it a habit of keeping track of other people's schedules." Margaret looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "Just accurate," he said. Edmund Pyle arrived on the Thursday train, and he was not what Margaret had expected, which was something she'd stopped apologizing to herself for. Her expectations had been revised enough times in the past month that she'd begun treating surprise as normal. He was younger than she'd anticipated, perhaps 38, 40 at most, with the slightly worn quality of a man who had been practicing law in territory conditions for long enough to lose the law school polish, but not the law school rigor. He had a sharp face and quick eyes, and he listened with the concentrated attention of someone who had learned that what clients left out was usually as important as what they said. Wade brought him directly to the ranch from the station, and they sat at the kitchen table, the 3 of them, with Cletus added after 10 minutes because he'd been hovering near the kitchen door and it was easier to include him. And Margaret laid out everything. She told it in order. She presented the documents in the sequence she'd organized them, cross-referenced and annotated, with the timeline clearly marked and the contradictions between Harlan's filed documents and her own records specifically highlighted. She spoke for nearly an hour without being interrupted, because Pyle had the good sense to let a witness present their account before he started poking at it. When she finished, he sat back and looked at the table covered in papers. "The diary entry from the 14th of January, he said. "You still have that volume?" "It's in my room." "Get it." She went and got it. He read the entry twice, then set it beside the county record showing the signature date, and looked at both of them for a long moment. "This is not nothing," he said. I know, she said. The challenge is that we're contesting a Philadelphia court order in a Montana territory court. The jurisdictional question alone— Crane, Wade said. Pyle looked at him. Margaret produced the card. A man named Thaddeus Crane, land commissioner for the territory. He was in the sheriff's office the day I went in. He suggested you contact him. Pyle took the card and looked at it with the expression of a man who has just had a door open that he wasn't expecting. Thaddeus Crane. You know him? I know of him. He tapped the card against the table. If Crane has territorial jurisdiction over this matter and is willing to intervene, the jurisdictional problem becomes significantly more manageable. He looked at Margaret. What else did he say to you? She told him. Pyle listened to the part about Harlan's other operations with the focused attention of a man filing information into very specific locations. Other cases? He said. That's what he implied. With evidence. He was careful about promising evidence. Pyle nodded slowly. He was looking at the table, seeing something that wasn't on it. If there are prior cases, if there's a pattern of fraud that can be established across multiple jurisdictions, that changes the nature of what we're bringing to the judge. We're not arguing a property dispute anymore. We're presenting a pattern of criminal conduct. Can you do that in the time available? Wade asked. 11 days. Pyle looked at the ceiling briefly. I can contact Crane tonight. I can file to have the matter placed on the judge's docket as a priority, given the active legal harassment currently occurring. And I need— He turned to Margaret. I need you to write down every name you can remember. Anyone who witnessed anything during Robert's illness. Former neighbors, boarders, the young lawyer who represented you initially. Anyone. Even people who might remember small things. The doctor who treated Robert. Dr. Ellison, she said immediately. He was the attending physician. He would have records. Can he be contacted? He's in Philadelphia. I don't know if he's still practicing. I'll find out. Pyle began making his own notes. The thing about a man like Voss is that he relies on people not comparing notes. He relies on each victim being isolated from the others, on each jurisdiction not knowing what happened in the last one. He looked up. What we're doing is making all of it visible at the same time. If Crane has what he implied he has, Voss walked into this territory expecting to close off a loose end, and instead he walked into the sum total of everything he's done. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Cletus said, from where he'd been sitting at the end of the table with his arms folded and his face doing the thing it did when he was thinking more than he was showing, "What happens to a man like that when all of it becomes visible?" Pyle looked at him. In my experience, either he runs or he doubles down and makes mistakes. He paused. Intelligent men who have operated without consequence for a long time have a difficult time believing the ground has changed under them. They keep doing the thing that has always worked until it stops working, and by the time they notice it has stopped, it's too late to adjust. Outside, the October wind moved through the yard, and somewhere down the road toward Colburn, a horse was moving fast. The fast horse turned out to be Doyle, coming from town with the expression of someone carrying information that wouldn't wait. He came into the kitchen without knocking, which was not his usual way, and he looked at Wade and then at the assembled group at the table and said, "The man, Voss. He was at the Colburn Hotel tonight, and I heard people are saying he's telling anyone who'll listen that Mrs. Whitmore has been operating under a false name and that there are fraud charges pending in Philadelphia." The room absorbed this. Margaret said, "There are no fraud charges pending in Philadelphia." "I know that," Doyle said, "but it's what he's saying." Pyle looked at Wade. "That's defamation. In a town where half the people don't know her yet and the other half are still deciding," Wade said. Margaret stood up from the table. She was aware of all of them looking at her, reading her reaction. And she was aware that her reaction in this moment would set something, would establish for Pyle, for Doyle, even for Wade, whether she was the kind of woman who could hold herself together when the walls started moving in, or whether the accumulated weight of it was finally going to be the thing that put her on the floor. She was tired. She was genuinely, deeply tired, not the physical tiredness of the ranch work, which she had found oddly restorative, but the tiredness of 3 years of being a target of a specific person's specific contempt. of having to be 2 steps ahead of someone who never stopped coming, of performing steadiness in rooms full of people who were deciding whether she was worth the trouble of believing. She was tired of it. She said, "We work tonight. Pyle, I'll give you every name I have. Wade, tomorrow morning I need you to go to the hotel and confirm with the desk that Voss is planning to stay through the judge's arrival. If he's going to run, I'd rather know now than the night before." She looked at Doyle. "Thank you for coming straight here." Doyle nodded and left. Pyle had his pen ready. Wade looked at her across the table, and in his face was the thing she had been learning over the past 2 weeks to trust. Not reassurance, nothing as simple as that. Just presence. The face of someone who had decided that whatever came through that door next, they were not going to face it alone. And who had decided that with sufficient groundedness that it had become a simple fact of the situation rather than a promise requiring maintenance. She sat back down. "Start with the doctor," Pyle said. "Everything you remember about him. Full name, practice address, anything he said to you during Robert's illness that indicated his assessment of Robert's condition." She opened her mouth to begin, and outside the window the October night pressed against the glass, cold and absolute, and in the direction of Colburn the lights of the small town burned with the particular smallness of human light against the scale of the Montana dark. And somewhere in one of those lit windows, Harlan Voss was telling his version of her story to anyone who would listen. She intended to make sure they heard the other version before a judge who had not yet been told what to think. She began to talk, and Pyle's pen moved, and the lamp on the kitchen table held them all in its circle, and the night outside could wait. They worked until nearly midnight. Pyle filled 12 pages of notes. Margaret gave him every name she could retrieve. Dr. Ellison, the attending physician, a woman named Dorothea Marsh, who had been a long-term boarder at the boarding house and had witnessed Robert's condition during his final weeks. The young lawyer, whose name was Calvin Reese, who had represented her in the initial contest and had been outmaneuvered but not dishonest. 2 neighbors who had seen Harlan leaving the house on multiple occasions during the illness period. She gave him dates, descriptions, specific conversations she had written down within hours of their occurring, because she had kept a diary every day for 33 years, and the habit of precise recording was not something she could turn off even during the worst months of her life. Pyle kept writing. He asked questions that were sharp and specific and occasionally uncomfortable, not because he doubted her, but because he was looking for the places where her account could be challenged and wanted to know where they were before Harlan's attorney found them. There was a moment, around 10 o'clock, when he asked her to describe the day of the property transfer hearing in Philadelphia, and she got partway through the description and stopped. Not because she'd forgotten. The opposite. Because the memory of that courtroom was one of the ones that lived in a specific place in her body rather than just her mind. The kind of memory that doesn't stay in the past tense the way other memories do. Wade noticed her stop. He didn't say anything. He refilled her coffee cup without being asked, and she took a breath and continued. When she finished, Pyle sat back and looked at his notes for a long time. "You understand," he said, "that what I can do in the next 11 days has limits. I can contact Crane. I can get statements from people in this territory who have observed your conduct since you arrived. I can file the jurisdictional challenge and prepare your documentation for presentation to the judge." He looked at her directly. "What I cannot do is guarantee that evidence from Philadelphia arrives in time. Crane's implication about prior cases, I believe him, but implication is not a subpoena, and if whatever he has doesn't arrive before the hearing, we go in with what we have." "What we have is enough to raise serious questions," Margaret said. "It is. It may also be enough to win on its own merits. I want you to understand it's not a certainty." "Nothing is a certainty," she said. "I stopped expecting certainty 3 years ago. What I expect now is a fair hearing. That's all I'm asking for." Pyle nodded. He gathered his notes. He told them he would contact Crane first thing in the morning, send urgent correspondence to every name on the list that could be reached by telegraph, and file the jurisdictional challenge with the court clerk the moment the office opened. Wade drove him back to the hotel in town, and Margaret sat alone in the kitchen after they'd gone and did not do anything for a while, which was not something she did often. She sat and listened to the ranch settle into the night. The particular sounds of a place at rest, the stove ticking, the distant sound of one of the horses shifting in the barn, the wind moving in a long, slow current off the mountains. She thought about Robert, not with grief exactly. Grief had done its work on her, and she'd done her work on it. And what was left was something quieter and more complex, the way a healed injury leaves behind not pain, but weather sense. She thought about the man he'd actually been, separate from what had been done to his name after his death. He had been decent, as she'd told Wade. He had been a man who tried. He had trusted the wrong person, which was a failing that cost him nothing directly because he had not lived to see what it cost her. She had been angry about that for a long time, and she was not entirely finished being angry about it, and she was honest enough with herself not to pretend otherwise. But she also thought about something else. She thought about the fact that somewhere in her worn leather suitcase was the deed with Robert's name and her name together on it, and that the existence of that document, the original, the one Harlan had not been able to reach because she'd kept it on her person through the entire eviction from the boarding house, tucked inside her dress because some instinct older than strategy had told her not to let go of it, was the reason they had a case at all. Robert had put her name on that deed because he had known, whatever else he was uncertain about, that the boarding house was as much hers as his. He had known that. It was a small thing, and it was an enormous thing simultaneously. She went to bed at 11 and slept better than she had any right to expect. The next 9 days were the longest of her time in Montana, which was saying something given that the first day had involved crying on a train platform in front of 30 strangers. Pyle worked with a focused efficiency that she found reassuring, not because it guaranteed outcomes, but because it was the efficiency of someone who was taking the thing seriously and not condescending to her in the process. He contacted Crane within the first 24 hours and reported back that Crane had been, in his words, expecting the call, which Margaret took as confirmation that whatever Crane had, he had been holding it in readiness. Crane himself came to the ranch on the third day. He sat at the kitchen table. Margaret had begun to think of that table as the place where everything important in her new life had occurred, which was perhaps appropriate given that most important things in most lives happened at kitchen tables rather than anywhere more dramatic. And he told them, carefully and with the precision of a man who had learned to be precise because imprecision had consequences, what he had. There were 2 prior cases, one in Wyoming Territory, 8 years earlier, one in Kansas, 5 years after that. In both cases, the pattern was identical. A recently widowed woman, a step relation who had positioned himself as helpful during the illness period, forged documents, property transfer, a character campaign to prevent effective contest. In the Wyoming case, the woman had died within a year of losing her property, old and in poverty, and there had never been a legal reckoning. In the Kansas case, a lawyer had picked up the thread of the fraud, but the case had stalled in court for 3 years before the woman ran out of resources to continue pursuing it, and the matter was dropped. Crane had both case files. He had testimony from the Kansas attorney. He had, through a correspondence network that he'd been quietly building across 3 territories for 7 years, affidavits from witnesses in both prior cases who had observed Harlan's conduct and had never been given a proper venue to say what they knew. Margaret sat at her kitchen table and listened to this, and felt something very specific happen in her chest. Not quite relief, because relief implies the danger is past, and the danger was not past yet. More like the sensation of a long-held breath becoming available to release. The feeling of having carried something alone for 3 years and suddenly understanding that you had not, in fact, been alone in carrying it, that other people in other places had been holding the same weight and had not known, any more than you had, that the others existed. He's done this before, she said, not as a question. 3 times that I can document, Crane said, possibly more that I haven't found. And he's never faced consequences. He's never faced a court with all of it in the room at the same time. Crane looked at her steadily. That's what's different this time. Wade said, will you testify? I will present the territorial evidence as a commissioner, Crane said. Testimony is a different matter. I am not a witness to the events, only to the pattern. But the pattern, presented through the case files and the affidavits in your documentation, speaks clearly enough on its own. 11 years, Margaret said quietly. He's been doing this for at least 11 years. Yes. She thought about the woman in Wyoming who had died in poverty. She thought about the woman in Kansas who had run out of resources before the court ran out of delays. She thought about how many versions of those two women she might have become under slightly different conditions. If she hadn't kept the deed on her person, if she hadn't maintained the diaries, if she hadn't answered Wade's advertisement, if she hadn't arrived in a place where the kitchen table conversation she'd had the first night had established her as someone worth standing beside. The difference between her situation and those two women's situations was not character. She was not braver or more capable or more deserving. The difference was documentation and proximity to the right people at the right moment, which was partially her own doing and partially the kind of accident that people like to attribute to fate because it was too uncomfortable to acknowledge how much of survival depended on luck. She didn't believe in crediting luck, but she believed in acknowledging it honestly. The night before the circuit judge arrived, Harlan made his final move. It was not what any of them had anticipated, which was itself a sign of how much his calculations had shifted. He didn't go to the sheriff, he didn't go to the newspaper, he came to the ranch. He came alone, in a rented buggy, at 7 in the evening when the dark was already full and the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that meant November was 2 weeks away and not inclined to be gentle about arriving. He knocked on the front door like a man making a social call. Cletus was in the kitchen when the knock came and he was on his feet before the second knock, which told Margaret something about how Cletus had been spending the past week in terms of where his attention was directed. Wade answered the door. Harlan stood in the lamplight from the porch with his hat in his hands and his expression arranged into something that was designed to look like reluctance and read, to anyone who had spent time studying it, like a man performing reluctance rather than feeling it. "I'd like to speak with Margaret," he said, privately. "No," Wade said. "Wade, you don't call me by my first name," Wade said. "We're not acquainted. What you have to say to Margaret, you say in front of me, or you say it in front of the judge tomorrow morning." A pause. Harlan looked past him to where Margaret was standing in the hallway. "Margaret," he said, "please, 5 minutes." She looked at him. 3 years of dreaming about this moment, about seeing him standing somewhere she had ground and he didn't, about having enough behind her that she wasn't afraid of him. And what she actually felt standing in the hallway of Wade Granger's ranch looking at Harlan Voss on the porch was something much simpler and much less satisfying than any version of triumph she'd imagined. She felt tired of him. Just tired. "Say what you came to say," she said. "Wade stays." Harlan came inside, which she hadn't quite invited but hadn't prevented. He stood in the hallway and looked at the house, and she watched him calculate it. The solid walls, the evidence of a functioning household, the absence of the desperation he'd expected to find when he'd tracked her to Montana. "I'd like to propose a resolution," he said. "Go ahead." "I drop the property claim. I leave Montana. Whatever I've said to people in this town, I'll make it clear I was mistaken, that I was acting on incorrect information." He paused. "In exchange, you don't appear at the hearing tomorrow. You let the matter go. Both of us go back to our lives." The kitchen was very quiet. Wade said nothing. He had gone very still in the way he went still when he was thinking hard, and didn't want anyone to see the thinking. Margaret said, "Why?" "Because tomorrow's hearing," Harlan started. "No," she said. "Why now? Why this offer, tonight?" She looked at him. "You didn't come here to be reasonable, Harlan. You've spent 11 years being the opposite of reasonable, and it has worked consistently. Why is tonight different?" Something moved in his face. Not the controlled adjustment she'd seen at the sheriff's office, but something more involuntary. "Crane," he said. She waited. "Whatever Crane has—" He stopped. He pressed his lips together. He was a man deciding how much to reveal in order to protect the larger interest, and he had made that calculation so many times that the making of it was visible now, at least to her. "I'm not prepared for the Wyoming and Kansas material to be introduced. If it comes in tomorrow, the judge will see a pattern," she said. "Yes." He looked at her. And in the look was something she had not expected to see on Harlan Voss's face in any context, which was a kind of bare recognition, not remorse. She didn't believe in Harlan's capacity for remorse in any form that would do anyone any good, but recognition of a shift in the landscape that he was too experienced not to acknowledge. "You have more than I thought," he said. "I've had it for 3 years," she said. "I've just been waiting for a room that would look at it." He nodded slowly. He looked at his hat. "My offer stands." I know it does, she said. And my answer is no. He looked up. I'm not interested in a private resolution, Harlan. Not because I want to punish you. Although I want to be honest with you, I'm not feeling particularly charitable toward you either. I'm saying no because a private resolution doesn't help the woman in Wyoming who died without justice. And it doesn't help the woman in Kansas who ran out of money fighting you. And it doesn't help whoever comes after me if you leave Montana with nothing behind you but the lesson that offering a deal at the last minute is sufficient escape route. She held his gaze. You'll be in the courtroom tomorrow morning, or the judge will notice your absence, and that will tell its own story. Harlan stood in the hallway of a house that was not his, being told no by a woman he had spent 3 years reducing to nothing, and he had no move left that Margaret could see, and she thought he probably couldn't see one either. He left without another word. Cletus, from the kitchen doorway, said, I'll sleep in the barn tonight. You don't have to, Wade started. I know I don't have to. Cletus went to get his coat. I'm going to. After he was gone, Wade looked at Margaret in the hallway. You all right? He said. She considered the question with the same honest attention she gave every question. I'm not afraid of tomorrow, she said. That's new. As of tonight, I'm not afraid of it. He nodded. He reached out and put his hand briefly on her arm, not pulling her toward him, not making it into something larger than what it was. Just the weight of a hand, warm and specific and deliberate. Go to sleep, he said. Tomorrow's early. She went to sleep. For the first time since the letter with Harlan's return address had appeared in her hands, she slept the full night through. The courtroom in Colburn was not really a courtroom. It was the town hall's main room, with the regular furniture pushed to the walls and a table set up at the front where Judge Aldous Merritt sat with the resigned authority of a man who had been holding circuit court in inadequate rooms across 3 territories for 22 years and had stopped being annoyed by the inadequacy approximately 15 years ago. He was older than Margaret had expected, perhaps 70, with the white hair and deliberate movement of significant age, but eyes that were sharp enough to make her understand that the age was not the important part about him. The room was fuller than it had any right to be for a legal proceeding. Margaret recognized most of the faces. She recognized the curiosity in them, which was not entirely comfortable but was also not entirely hostile. And she recognized that the room's interest in this proceeding was itself a kind of power. If she thought about it right, all these people here to see what would happen was, in its way, the opposite of the private Philadelphia courtroom, where no one had been watching because Harlan had made sure there was nothing to watch. Here, everything was visible. That was the difference. Pyle sat beside her at the claimant's table. Crane sat in the row behind, which was the position of a witness prepared to be called rather than a direct participant. Wade sat beside Crane. He had put on the better of his 2 jackets, which Margaret had noticed and said nothing about, but had felt something about. Harlan was at the other table with a lawyer he'd managed to retain from the next county, a man named Stoddard, who had the look of someone who had accepted this case without being told everything about it, and was now sitting next to his client with the specific alertness of a lawyer who has realized the terrain is different than advertised. Judge Merritt opened the proceeding without ceremony and allowed Pyle to present first, which was the right call given that Margaret's side had filed the matter. Pyle was good. He was not theatrical. He seemed to understand that Merritt was not a man who responded to theater, but he was organized and specific, and he built the case in an order that was almost architectural, each element placed so that the next one had somewhere solid to rest. He presented the original deed. He presented Robert's letters. He presented the accounting books. He presented the diary entry from January 14th with the county record of the signature date beside it. And he let Judge Merritt look at them together in silence for nearly a minute, which was the right instinct. Then he presented the Wyoming materials, then the Kansas materials. Then Crane took the stand and walked the judge through the pattern across all 3 cases with the methodical clarity of a man who had been building toward this moment for 7 years and was not going to rush it now that it had arrived. The room, which had been doing the human thing of shifting and settling and exchanging glances, went very quiet during Crane's testimony. The particular quiet of people who were understanding something they hadn't understood when they came in. Stoddard objected to the prior case materials on relevance grounds. Merritt overruled him with the economy of a judge who has already formed a view and is not interested in extending the proceeding unnecessarily. Harlan, Margaret noticed, was very still at his table, not the performed stillness of his usual manner. The stillness of a man who is listening to the walls come down and has not yet decided what to do about it. Stoddard cross-examined Margaret because he had to do something, and the cross-examination was not aggressive. He was too experienced to be aggressive with a witness who had better documentation than his client, which was a situation that called for delicacy rather than pressure. He asked her about gaps in the diary record, about the young lawyer who'd represented her in Philadelphia, about the specific chain of custody of the documents she'd brought to Montana. She answered every question with the patience of someone who had organized everything and was not afraid of questions about the organization. She was aware, answering, of the room listening, of Mrs. Caldwell in the third row with her hands folded and her face attentive, of old Keller near the back wall, of the two women from the Ladies' Aid Society whose names she'd never learned who were watching her with expressions that had started the morning skeptical and were doing something different now. She was aware of Wade, who was not watching the proceedings with anxiety, but with the settled, grounded attention he brought to everything, the face of someone who had made his assessment and was not in the process of revising it. She had not looked for that face. She had not needed it to steady her. But she was aware of it the way you're aware of a good fence line, not because you're leaning on it, but because knowing it's there changes how you move through the field. When Stoddard finished, Merritt asked Harlan directly whether he wished to take the stand. Stoddard leaned in and said something to him quietly. Harlan listened. Then he said, "No, Your Honor." Merritt nodded. He looked at the materials on his table. He looked at the room. He said he would take a brief recess to review the documentary evidence, and that he expected to rule before the end of the morning session. The recess was 40 minutes. Margaret sat at the claimant's table, and Pyle talked to her about procedural matters she only partially absorbed, and Crane came and stood beside Pyle and spoke quietly to him, and Wade brought her a cup of water from the back of the room and set it in front of her without comment. She drank it. She thought, in the 40 minutes, about very little and very much simultaneously. She thought about the train platform 3 weeks ago and the weight of her suitcase and the sound of strangers laughing at something that wasn't funny. She thought about the first night at the kitchen table and the coffee, and the way the silence between them had been a different kind of silence than she'd lived in for 3 years. She thought about the document in Pyle's folder that had her name on it alongside Robert's, the original, the one she'd pressed against her chest walking out of the boarding house for the last time. And she thought about how she had not known then what she was doing or where she was going, only that she was not going to let go of the one piece of paper that proved she had been real and present and part of something that had mattered. She had turned out to be right to hold on. She was not always right, and she had made mistakes in the 3 years since that she could name specifically, but she had been right about that. Merritt came back. He sat down. He arranged the papers in front of him. He looked at the room over his glasses. In the matter of the property claim filed by Mr. Harlan Voss against Mrs. Margaret Whitmore, he said, "The court finds the claim to be without legitimate legal foundation in this jurisdiction and in conflict with documented evidence that substantially predates and contradicts the Philadelphia court filing." He paused. He turned a page. Further, the court finds that the Philadelphia court filing itself was obtained through material misrepresentation, as evidenced by the documentary record before this court, including the physician's records pertaining to the decedent's capacity on the dates in question. He looked up from the paper. "The claim is dismissed." Stoddard was writing something. Harlan was very still. "Additionally," Merritt said, and the room registered the word as indicating something further was coming, and the room got quiet again. Having reviewed the pattern of conduct documented across 3 jurisdictions by Commissioner Crane, this court is referring the matter to the Territorial Attorney General's office for review of potential criminal charges, including fraud, forgery, and the deliberate misrepresentation of legal documents to effect unlawful property transfer. He set down the paper. He looked at Harlan with the look of a man who has seen the thing he's looking at before and is tired of seeing it. "Mr. Voss, you are not to leave this territory pending notification from the Attorney General's office. Sheriff Holt will ensure your availability." That was the moment. Not a dramatic moment. Merritt had delivered it with the flat precision of a man stating facts rather than performing justice, which was somehow more affecting than drama would have been. Holt moved to stand near Harlan's table, and Stoddard said something to Harlan, and Harlan nodded once and sat with his hands flat on the table in front of him. He looked, in that moment, like a man at the exact point where the long run of unchecked behavior had reached its end. And the look was not satisfying to Margaret in the way she might have expected. It was not nothing. She would be dishonest to call it nothing. But it was less than she'd imagined it would be. Because what she felt most was not triumph over him. What she felt most was the specific concrete reality of the weight lifting off her own shoulders, which was a private thing that had nothing to do with him at all. She became aware that people were moving. Pyle was shaking her hand. Crane was speaking to Merritt at the front. The room was reassembling itself into the ordinary noise of people with opinions about what had just happened. She stood up. Wade was there. He didn't say anything immediately, which was right. He just stood in front of her, solid and present, and she looked at him, and he looked back. And the looking carried everything that couldn't be organized into the words available in that particular moment. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. She laughed. It surprised her. The laugh arrived before she'd decided to produce it, which was unusual for her, and it was not an entirely controlled sound, which was also unusual, and she pressed her hand to her mouth for a moment until it settled. "I want to go home," she said. He said, "Then let's go home." They were married 3 weeks later. Not in the town hall, not in any official space. In the yard of the ranch, on a Saturday morning when the first real snow had come and gone overnight and left the ground white and the sky the particular blue that only appears after snow in mountain country, hard and clear and infinite. Pyle came. Crane came. Cletus stood beside Wade with the expression of a man who had opinions about weddings and was keeping them to himself out of respect for the occasion. Doyle and Perkins stood near the barn with their hats in their hands. Mrs. Caldwell came, which was not something Margaret had expected and which meant something she was still figuring out the precise shape of. She'd brought 2 women from the Ladies' Aid Society, one of whom cried, which Margaret found disproportionate but not unkind. The ceremony was brief because brevity was what both of them wanted, and neither of them was inclined to be talked out of what they wanted. They said the words and signed the paper, and that was the thing done. Afterward, in the kitchen, with more people than the room comfortably held and a quantity of food that Mrs. Caldwell had organized without being asked, Margaret stood near the window with a cup of coffee and looked out at the yard. The barn, the repaired porch steps, the fence line that Doyle and Perkins had spent 2 weeks fixing, the garden space that would be turned over properly in the spring and planted with things she was already planning. Cletus came and stood beside her, which was not a thing he usually did voluntarily at social gatherings. "You're going to change things here," he said. Not accusatory. More like a man acknowledging a fact he's been watching develop. "Some things," she said. "Not everything. The account books are already different. They're more accurate." He was quiet for a moment. "I was wrong," he said. "When you arrived, I wasn't sure what to make of you. Most people weren't." "I'm saying I was wrong," he said, which was clearly not an easy sentence for him and which she appreciated precisely because of that. "You weren't wrong to be uncertain," she said. "You didn't know me." She looked at him. "You know me now." He nodded. He went back toward the group by the stove, and she heard him say something to Doyle that made Doyle laugh, and she turned back to the window. Wade appeared beside her with his own coffee. He'd managed to extract himself from the cluster of people wanting to talk to him, which she understood had cost him some effort because he was not a man who found extracting himself from social obligation easy when he felt the obligation was genuine. They stood at the window together and looked at the yard. "The feed store situation," she said. "Jonas Perrin agreed to refund the overage?" $214, he said. "Arrived last week. It's in the account. That's the barn roof and the fence posts and 4 months of a hired hand." "I know. We should hire the hand before spring." "I know that too." She looked at him. He was looking at the yard with the expression he wore when he was thinking about what the land needed, and the expression he wore when he was thinking about something else had, over the past month, become slightly different things that she was learning to distinguish. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He turned from the window and looked at her. "I'm thinking that the last time this house had this many people in it was my son's christening," he said. 30 years ago, roughly. She held that carefully. She knew the weight of it. Not to fix. not to respond to in any way that would make it smaller than it was, just to hold. Was it like this? She asked. The noise of it. Louder, he said. Claire's family had opinions about everything and expressed all of them simultaneously. He looked at the room. But the feeling is the same. The feeling of the house doing what it was built for. She thought about the boarding house on the long table in the dining room. 12 people every night, all kinds. The specific gift of a place that served as the stage for other people's lives passing through. This was different. This was not transient. This was the thing she'd been building toward for 30 years without knowing the final shape of it. Not a place where people passed through, but a place where she stayed. Where the work she did yesterday was still there the next day and the day after, accumulating into something that would outlast the doing of it. She was 56 years old. There were people who would tell you, and had told her to her face, that 56 was too old for beginning, that the years behind her outweighed the years ahead in a way that made new things inadvisable, that the appropriate work of a woman her age was contraction rather than expansion, tidying rather than building. She had never believed that. She had been told it so many times and by so many people that there had been moments in the past 3 years when she'd come close to accepting it, which was different from believing it and considerably more dangerous. But she had not accepted it. She had organized the evidence against it in her kitchen, and she had ridden into town with it pressed against her chest, and she had stood in a room where someone finally looked at it, and the not believing had turned out to be the thing that was true. The life in front of her was not a consolation prize for the life behind her. It was its own thing, with its own demands and its own possibilities and its own specific pleasures. The cold Montana morning air and the account books coming right and the sound of another person moving through the same house at the same time, which was an ordinary thing that had turned out to be extraordinary once she'd understood what its absence felt like. Wade said, "Next summer, if the barn roof holds, I thought we might take on another 50 head. She considered, "We'd need to expand the grazing rotation. The south pasture's been underused." "I know. I was thinking about what you said about the fence line along the creek. If we move it 20 yards west, we pick up the good grass without disturbing the water access." "That's what I was thinking." They stood at the window with their coffee and talked about the south pasture fence line, and the room full of people behind them made its human noise, and the yard outside was white from last night's snow and clear from this morning's sun. And the mountains held their permanent position at the edge of everything, older than any of the things happening at their feet. This is what she would remember later, from that day. Not the courtroom and Merritt's ruling, not even the ceremony in the yard. This, the two of them at the window with cold coffee and a practical conversation, the room behind them, the mountains ahead. The train that had brought her to Colburn 6 weeks earlier had arrived with her weeping on the platform, and the town had looked at that and drawn its conclusions, and nearly all of its conclusions had been wrong. She had arrived crying not because she was weak, but because she had been strong for 3 years without permission to stop, and the first kind word had opened something in her that needed to be opened. She had arrived without resources, not because she had failed, but because she had been systematically stripped of them by someone who had dedicated considerable intelligence to the task. She had arrived old by some reckonings, too old by others. And she had organized a kitchen and caught a fraud and built a case and stood in a courtroom and declined a settlement from a man who had never once been told no before. She had not done it perfectly. She had been afraid, in ways she hadn't always showed. She had made Wade tell her she was all right here, and she had needed to hear it even though needing it made her uncomfortable. She had sat at this kitchen table and forced herself to keep speaking when the Philadelphia courtroom memory had come up through the floor of her, because stopping would have cost more than continuing. She had been, throughout, a woman who was sometimes tired and occasionally afraid and not always certain, and who had kept going anyway, which was, when you examined it honestly, the whole of what survival required. Not the absence of fear or doubt or exhaustion, just the willingness to keep going while they were present. She had done that. Whatever else was true, she had done that. And now she was standing at a window in a house that was hers in the way the boarding house had been hers, in the way nothing had been hers for 3 years. And through the window was a yard that needed work, and beyond the yard were mountains that were indifferent to human events. In the way that things that have existed for 10 million years are indifferent, and beside her was a man who had put her name in a letter and meant what he said when he wrote it, and the sum of those things was a life. Not a perfect one. She was too experienced to expect perfect, and too honest to want it if it meant falsifying the record. A real one, with real difficulties still ahead, and real rewards she had not yet discovered, and real mornings of Montana cold coming that would require real work to get through. A real one was enough. A real one was more than enough. Wade said, "Spring planting. Are you planting the kitchen garden yourself, or are you willing to take suggestions?" She said, "I'll take suggestions under advisement." He said, "That's what I expected." She said, "Good. We understand each other." Outside, the snow on the yard was beginning to melt at the edges where the sun had found it, and the mountains stood in their blue distance, and the house held its people with the solid, unglamorous permanence of something built to last.